Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 26, Soul Society, Part 8. Throughout civilization, battle had always marked the point of change. Humans fought wars, changing their leaders, beliefs, and even the land itself to suit their means. In which case, the winner determines the result. The one to decide the path of the future. Amidst the sound of gunfire screaming in a torrential downpour, war brought about the coming of a new era for humans, and this was the same for the Soul Society. Yamamoto of the older generation lived from a time where there was no such organization as the 13 court guard squads of the Society. Instead, he and his compatriots had wandered in a world of bloodshed where strength was the largest deterrent. With enemies all around, and no place to truly call home, they forged a path by the sharp edge of their own swords. That strength was one that Yamamoto had in excess, dominating the previous era in the conflict against the Quincy and Hollows of old. Swords and arrows made for killing were common in conflict, yet this time, it was truly different. Floating ominously within the Society's sky, was a vast blot of steel and armaments releasing a pressure Yamamoto had never once felt before. Weapons of legend and reverie. Noble phantasms. Yet in Yamamoto's eyes, they were something more. They emanated an aura that demanded a respect earned only from the battlefield. Something Yamamoto was quite clear on as a veteran of the Soul Society's past conflicts. How much blood must one draw in order to release such a heavy bloodlust? A red barbed spear hung loosely in the air, red vein-like structures seemingly pulsating with a demonic spiritual energy that manifested the image of a snarling dog. Before it, the weapons and Zanpakuto the lower-seated officers carried paled in comparison. Yet Yamamoto's eyes had already moved elsewhere. An aura of tranquility, bearing the principalities of kindness, humility, and faith. That flag tied upon the end of a spear billowing alone in the wind had a presence greater than even the most ferocious of individuals. It was plain and simple, yet it was in this state of a lofty and lonely disregard, that it gave the most substantial impact. A single banner amidst an army of gleaming silver. And even then, there was more. Countless more. For a moment, Yamamoto was left at a loss, staring blankly ahead of him and towards the image of his own Zanpakuto amidst that steel. Impossible. He had only drawn Rajuinjaka once, and even then, he hadn't even released it from its cane form, granted the one before him was also in the form of a cane. However, just from the presence the other swords were emitting around it, it was clear that the possibility that he would be facing his own Zanpakuto may be a reality. And this sunk in deeper than the sharpest of daggers. His own partner, and the power he knew that it was able to wield. If this King of Hollows had access to his Bankai, then the Society would burn in a flame never before seen in millenniums. Anohana, he called, his voice coming out rasped. Captain, Anohana said after jolting herself out of her dazed state. Evacuate the seated officers. This battle is no longer at a scale in which they can participate in. With the new generation, comes feeble embers, but even embers can ignite a fire, he spoke with certainty. The Society has never once fallen, nor will it ever. Understood, Anohana said calmly before immediately issuing out the order. She then sent a concerned glance at Yamamoto. Be careful, she said. Yamamoto grunted, but his order to evacuate the seated officers didn't change. If in the worst case, the Society is defeated, then all hope would then rest upon those that got away. For such a means, it was best to be prepared. He then stared hard at the King of Hollows, standing alone within that meshwork of metal. The other Vasto lords stood on either side of the king, their eyes alight with an eager satisfaction at seeing the seated officers leave. He would not allow that satisfaction to remain on their faces. Captains, prepare for battle, he said. Toshiro, Shunsui, Tuan, Komamura, Soifone, Jin, and Kenpeki all readied themselves. Yet, Yamamoto made a mental note to himself as Aizen had yet to arrive. Byakuya was injured and had gone missing, so he was already accounted for, yet Aizen had no excuses to not have had seen the gathering signal. Could it be that Aizen was already taken down? Yamamoto's face darkened. It was a possibility. Grasping tightly onto Raijinjaka, the wood around the blade began to fade away into burning ashes, revealing the sword beneath. You have trespassed on the Soul Society's grounds, and have killed our people. Yamamoto's voice was cold. Your sentence is death. His was a blade of fire the likes of which could burn away even the toughest of metals such that they evaporate away like water. Wisps of dancing flame traveled down Ryujinjaka's blade and curled around its pommel. The temperature in the area skyrocketed, making it harder to breathe as the fire ate away at the air. Come, Hollow, Yamamoto beckoned. I will show you why it is that swords and spears are forged in fire. And I will show you why it is that the blacksmith is the master of flame. The voice that came from the Hollow King's mouth was eerily calm, as if unaffected by Yamamoto's display of power. Thereafter, the swords rained down with Yamamoto's movement. Knives, daggers, spears, they descended the fastest, carpet-bombing everything in sight. They were so fast that only shadows could be seen. Sit upon the frozen heavens, higher in Meru. A sheet of ice appeared in the sky, lumbering and emitting a chilling fog. It blocked the majority of the descending weapons, yet not all. It's that spear. Toshiro warned. The very same red spear that had ripped through the Siriti's protective dome pierced holes through the sheet of ice Toshiro had created. Almost like Swiss cheese, they shredded straight through the frosty layer unimpeded. Use physical attacks. So iPhone called, vaulting over Toshiro as she parried red spear after red spear. Gidirg, the crimson rose of exorcism. Under its pointed edge, all ties of energy were severed. True to So-iPhone's reputation as the captain of the stealth force, her speed alone allowed her to deflect all the incoming projectiles of Gidirg. Never-ending clanging noises echoed throughout the sky as So-iPhone faded in and out of vision, shifting the trajectories of the spears. Yet, it wouldn't be enough. I don't think so. A hand planted itself upon So-iPhone's face. Eyes widening, So-iPhone had no time to react before she was hurled across the distance, sending her tumbling in the air. Gritting her teeth, So-iPhone forcibly stopped herself and glared at Nell in a stagger. You were already lucky to escape death, yet now you are clearly seeking it. She yelled. Sting all enemies to death, Suzumibuki. A black and gold-rimmed stinger appeared over So-iPhone's hand, glowing with a dull light made from spiritual energy. I assure you, Nell said, moving a hand to grip her lance. It is not me who will be suffering today. A fierceness shone in Nell's eyes, attributing to her heritage as a hollow. This time I don't see your friend helping you. Almost before So-iPhone could react, a spear's tip was just before her head, powered by the explosive strength of a zero. Veins popping in her eyes, she twisted her body backwards such that she only lost a couple strands of her hair. So-iPhone. Toshiro called. Yet before he could provide aid, he felt a shift in the sheets of ice he had created to blanket the rain of swords. You Shinigami truly do not understand, a dark and deep voice spoke. Up above, in the direction of the ice sheets, a purple mass of dark spiritual energy suddenly tore a hole through the ice. Like acid, it began to corrode away anything it touched. Here, standing before you, is death itself. The god of Hueco Mundo, Baragan Lusenburn. From the ice there appeared a hand of bone. Gold-colored bracelets around a thin wrist dangled gently. A simple flick of a hand sending a cloud of corroding gas towards the ice and completely eradicating it. There past the ice, and wreathed in a regal mantle of flowing violet fur, a skeleton stood tall. I am time itself. Look upon the breath of death, Respira. Mouth opening, a dark miasma instantly descended down. Unlike the King of Hollows, Baragan was merciless. His attack was not directed towards the captain, but at the seated officers and lower-ranked Shinigami Anohana was leading away. Filth. Yamamoto raged. With a flick of his sleeve, a wave of fire enshrouded the miasma containing it within. Baragan was far from pleased. Fool, you are only delaying the inevitable. Even as Baragan spoke, tiny wisps of Yamamoto's flame were slowly being eaten away, yet still they remained. It was a flame that burned for an eternity. Baragan clenched his teeth, realizing this before he instead turned to look up. I will not be bested here, Baragan muttered. Looking at the direction Baragan was staring at, Yamamoto realized that Baragan was staring to the King of Hollows, the Vasto of White. Thereafter, Baragan roared, clouds of death shooting out from his body in all directions. Before it, everything was rotting away. My, isn't that an interesting ability? Jin spoke offhandedly as he hurriedly retreated along with Tuan. Some of the other retreating Shinigami weren't so lucky. A single touch, and the skin began to fade away from their bones, leaving nothing behind but ashes in the wind. Yamamoto's expression grew grave. Ryujin Jaka. A dome of fire surrounded Baragan completely, clashing with the miasma Baragan was releasing. However, no matter how eternal a flame, it would only burn as long as there was something to burn. The space around Baragan was completely empty, void of anything, and preventing the fire from reaching him. Yet, he couldn't move either. Releasing a breath, Yamamoto then turned his attention back to the King of Hollows. More precisely, to the vibrating red spear whose bloodlust only continued to increase. With Soifone preoccupied, the task of deflecting the falling weapons fell upon Seijin Komamura and Zaraki Kenpeki. Unlike Seijin, who had a troubled expression from beneath his helmed visage, Zaraki had a feral smile on his face. The two had noticed the bloodlust coming from the red spear almost immediately. "Be careful," Tuan called out to Seijin, but was hard-pressed to say anything else when Haribel struck down on him. The shark fin blade in her hands may seem dauntingly large and bulky, but it belayed a swiftness and edge not seen on the surface. More so when a yellow spiritual energy burst forth from the blade and created an explosion. "Can aim!" Seijin shouted in alarm, yet he couldn't aid his friend as it was more important to stop the descent of the swords. As for Shunsui, he was staring impassively at Ulquiorra, who simply stared back before the both disappeared into action. "Enough!" Yamamoto yelled. With this shout, an immense spiritual pressure weighed down on the area. It was almost visible as even the air itself seemed to distort. Raising a hand, Yamamoto immediately aimed a torrent of flame towards the red spear thrumming with demonic power. Whatever kind of ability that spear had, Zanpakuto or not, Yamamoto did not wish to know. All that mattered was that he stops it. The Spear of the Red Plains. And the legend of the Hound of Ulster. An acute war cry reverberated throughout the sky, a gleaming red light bathing the area in a sea of purplish red. There was a certain heaviness that caused shivers to travel down people's spines. More so when a howl echoed in their ears. It pierces the heart. "Have you heard of legends?" The King of Hollows spoke solemnly. "Tales of weapons capable of crushing armies and changing the land itself." Yamamoto creased his brows, feeling the energy of his attack dwindling the closer it got to the spear. "Then let me show you." Thrumming gently, the red spear zipped into the Hollow King's hand, leaving a trail of red in the air and the clang of a pole arm to resound. The image that the Hollow King displayed changed completely with the addition of the spear. No longer did he just appear as a hollow that stood above the rest, but that bloodlust exuding from the spear spread over the Hollow King like a raging flame. In those amber-colored eyes, a dull crimson flashed. If hollows were savage and ruthless by nature, then there was no doubt that the Hollow King before everyone's eyes now was at the pinnacle. Shrouded in a fierce killing intent and bloodlust and never showing his back. He who stands at the front. Hollow's revered power. To be called king wasn't only because of actions, but through the strength one wielded. Instinct attracted the weak to the strong, and for Hollows, this was even more so. "Ooh!" Masked visages opened their jaws and wailed in proclamation by instinct, the respect and awe in their eyes hard to describe. Even the Vasto lords were affected, gazes heated as the compulsion to roar out nearly overrode their sense of reasoning. Everywhere, everyone gave pause. To the Shinigami staring up, the presence the King of Hollows exuded was suffocating. Yamamoto's eyes widened as the world itself seemed to distort with the King of Hollows' next movements. "Head Captain." Anohana's warning came to Yamamoto at just the precise moment. The Shinigami under him were cowering, they needed his guidance. Stilling his body, Yamamoto glared before spiking his spiritual energy, yet by then, the attack had already come. Gibalg. It was but a whisper in the wind. Something that was barely even audible, but it gave a power to that red spear like none other. Everyone could feel it. That bloodlust intensified such that it was impossible for the Vasto lords to reserve themselves any longer. For power itself to Hollows was intoxicating. Mouths opening, they released an ominous ear-deafening wail that heralded the coming of the barbed spear of death. The sound came from the gut, born from the desire of acquiring that which they no longer had. With a flourish of the Hollow King's hand, that spear descended, thrown forward like a missile loaded with power. It was like a meteor falling from the sky that multiplied into hundreds in an instant. Bankai. The temperature plummeted, clouds forming in the heavens, writhing tendrils of lightning within. And from those clouds came the snow. Falling gently to the earth, they froze upon contact, blooming into radiant ice flowers spanning the entirety of the Siritii. The dragon sitting upon the frozen skies. Its breath was frost, its eyes jade pools of sleet that shone with power in defiance to its attacker. The strongest ice Zanpakuto. Daigurin Hierin Meru. A dragon of ice sword, maw opened, and body releasing a numbing coldness that seeped into the bones. Barbed spear met dragon in a collision that created shockwaves that forced almost everyone back. From the dragon's front, a layer of ice magnitudes larger than the one before it intercepted Gibalg's path as the dragon converted its very body into a shield. Resplendent ephemeral light blinded the world, yet in that light, there existed a fierce crimson. Gibalg, the spear of the mightiest warrior Ireland had ever known. It alone had the power to crush armies. The cursed spear of striking death. It embodied the concept of cause and effect, yet rather than technique, it focused solely on the power and the area of effect, carpet bombing the entire area. A tapestry of action that splits into numerous spearheads distorting space. That spoken of in legend displayed itself once more. The attack of Ireland's Child of Light. C.U. Culane. And the legend of the Red Plains. Silence. Then an explosion that shattered the sheet of ice completely. Glacial sheets fell to the ground like rain, shards falling like hail. And at the very front, 3 ice petals floating behind the back of Captain Toshiro Hitsugaya shattered into fine mist. Blood seeped from his pores, and a gash on his forehead smeared crimson over the latter part of his face. He had used all of his spiritual energy to stop that attack, and even then, he wasn't able to completely stop it. Toshiro bitterly looked down at the hole in his stomach before his eyes darkened from the strain of staying conscious. Unlike before, he didn't have enough power to create a copy of himself in the ice. Therefore, this was his true body. Captain. A voice registered into Toshiro's ears, but even then, it sounded distant to him along with the rapidly approaching ground in his blurred gaze. Rangiku Matsumoto, Light of the 10th Division, broke off from where Anohana was leading her away with the other seated officers to catch Toshiro before he crashed onto the ground. However, a shadow soon loomed over the both of them. A hollow. Large, and bear-like, it lunged towards them. Even as the King of Hollows acted, the other hollows didn't remain idle. This was the case for Haribal and Nell, who were already engaging the enemy, and this was even more so for the hollows Baragan had brought with him. Rangiku's expression sunk before she gripped tightly onto her sword. Based on the power the hollow was emitting, it was Najicha's level for sure. Generally, she was confident in combating one, and even escaping should the situation prove dire, but she couldn't have any confidence now that she was protecting Toshiro behind her. Her gaze darted back and forth, but no one she could see was around to provide aid after Captain Anohana began evacuating the seated officers. Pursing her lips, she slashed out with her sword. Gah, she groaned as her Zanpakuto deadlocked with the hollow's claws. Behind her, she could hear Toshiro's breath growing faint. He needed medical attention or else he was going to die. Captain, hang on. She urged while gritting her teeth. Growl, Hanko. The sword lodged in between the hollow's claws faded away into a storm of silver ash that completely enshrouded the hollow. Each particle was a tiny blade that could seep into the smallest of pores. Spinning in a vortex, it began to eat away at the hollow's skin and body. However, Rangiku wasn't prepared for the tenacity the hollow displayed. Hanko took the form of silver ash. Anything the ash touched, Rangiku could cut at will with but a few gestures. However, unlike a sword, when the hollow chose to ignore its own defense and charged forward, there was nothing Rangiku could do to stop it. All she had in her hands was an empty hilt, the blade still in an ash-like form. Eyes widening, she swung Hanko furiously, each slicing motion opening a wound on the hollow. Yet, as Najicha's, its defenses were far stronger than regular hollows. It shrugged off all the injuries, intent on stabbing forward. Her complexion paled. She couldn't dodge. Behind her was her captain, and any more damage may result in his death. Damn it! She cursed. Abandoning any thoughts of attacking, Rangiku sheathed her blade and moved to pick up Toshiro off the ground. Yet, her movements were too slow. Just as she wrapped her arms around Toshiro's body to pick him up, a claw's shadow appeared right before her eyes. Unblinking, she stared in a daze at the sword suddenly pierced through the hollow's chest. Sleek, and dripping with blood, Rangiku followed the blade's shaft all the way to its hilt. Jijin! She cried out in alarm. Currently, mostly all of the captain of the Siridi were engaged in battle amidst the hollows and the rain of swords. It was difficult enough already to fend for themselves, but to fend for others as well? It would come at a cost. Smiling, Jin only shook his head while staring at Rangiku. Shinso, his Zanpakuto, was still pointed in her direction, but by doing so, Jin was forced to block his own enemy's attack with his own arm. Now hanging limp by his shoulder, Jin had to fight with the use of only his left arm. Rangiku didn't know what to say. Fool, idiot, nitwit, were all words that wanted to burst out from her mouth, but instead, it was just her tears that unexpectedly came. After all, Jin may very well die with how the situation was. The Hollow King was able to produce such a fear-inducing attack that had nearly killed Toshiro, and now that Jin was injured and constantly under attack, wouldn't he be next? And yet, even with the pressure on him, Jin still chose to save her. It wasn't fair. If she had only been stronger, then perhaps she'd finally understand Jin's reasons for leaving back then. Seeing Rangiku crying, a sharpness appeared in Jin's eyes before he stared at the hollow in front of him, and then to the hollows near Rangiku. The hand gripping his sword tightened as the smile on his face belied violent intentions along with his spike in spiritual pressure. Shoot to kill, Shinso. A sword that stretched across the horizons ripped a horizontal line across an entire horde of hollows, causing many Shinigami to cheer. Even Yamamoto gave a nod, but his attention was more focused on Toshiro. As the youngest captain, Yamamoto knew that Toshiro had the greatest potential to become one of the Soul Society's strongest pillars. He couldn't allow Toshiro to die, and seeing the state Toshiro was in after blocking the Hollow King's attack only made Yamamoto more furious. Anohana was quick to arrive to Toshiro and Rangiku. Having been leading the seated officers away, she was much farther from the battlefield and took a few moments longer to arrive. Upon arrival, Anohana immediately took Toshiro away for examination, a dull green glow encompassing Toshiro's body as Anohana activated her healing Kido. Yet her expression grew grim. This, impossible, she muttered to herself before the intensity of her Kibo increased several folds. The brilliant green light of her healing spiritual energy nearly fully engulfed the area, yet Anohana only appeared to look more and more strained. After all, the wound was barely healing at all. What sort of weapon could cause this? It wasn't healing. Pursing her lips, she tore off a segment of her haori to use it as a bandage. If her healing Kido wouldn't work, then all that she could do was hope that it would heal naturally. Quickly patching Toshiro up, she stared at Yamamoto, but couldn't give him the assurance he was looking for. For the first time in centuries, rage filled Yamamoto's very being. Wisps of steam appeared around him as the very air began to boil, reducing the structures around him to nothing more than cinders. What lay in front of him was still the Zanpakutos the King of Hollows had created, but he didn't care. Under the fires of annihilation, all would melt and burn. He had reserved himself, knowing full well what it would mean if he truly went all out. Torrents of roaring flames spewed forth from all around him, a sun descending upon the world. Get back, the head captain's attacking. Someone called. Almost immediately, all the Shinigami flash-stepped behind Yamamoto's back, leaving only the hollows at the front. The sound of crackling echoed in the air, like burning tinder. What was flame if not the element that brought about both life and ruin? It was flame that gave light, illuminating the dark and paving a path to a distant future. But it was also flame that scorched the very earth dry. Husks, ashes, and embers. The Shinigami of fire stood tall. A weathered back that knew not any scars appeared before the eyes of the Shinigami as the white haori of Squad 1 fell loosely in the wind. Ash meets ember, and so there is flame. Yamamoto's grip on his sword tightened, old muscles rippling with a power long forgotten in times of peace. Expression set in stone, there was a fierceness and resolve in Yamamoto's eyes that would never bend. None of you will live for your transgressions, Ryujin Jaka. It was a tidal wave of hellfire. Large torrents of fiery red stretched across the sky, like fingers grasping onto an object. A mixture of oranges and red, the fire itself appeared alive, smothering the swords in the sky and melting them into globs of searing goo. For all swords were once forged in flame, and so they shall return. The expression on the Hollow King's face changed. Shiro! Haribal called in warning. So, the King of Hollows was named Shiro? No matter, Yamamoto would make sure that it would be a name to be forgotten. The intensity of the flaming tendrils only seemed to increase further. Black scorch marks marred the ground, and hollows began falling from the sky like flies, the heat causing their skin to bubble. Yet, as if to defy Yamamoto's intentions, a lone banner stood billowing in the flame. Its regal whites and gold unable to be marred by the blackness of ash. A banner of purity, tranquility, and faith that suddenly exploded with power. There was once a woman who fought for her country. A farmer's girl. A commoner who knew not of bloodshed and war, yet took up arms anyway. A saint. For God was with her. Luminosite eternal. The will and devotion placed upon that banner still remained even without the original owner, for an eternity. The embodiment of a single woman's love for her country, and the desire to protect she left behind. The hero of the 100 Years' War. Jeanne d'Arc. It was a light from the heavens that shone down from the world of fire, enshrouding Shiro and the rest in a protective coat of holy energy. It was the greatest contradiction any Shinigami had ever seen. That power was holy, something perhaps only wielded by the Soul King himself. Yet to see that kind of holy power protecting hollows, Yamamoto and many other Shinigami were stunned. Even more so when a giant Garganta formed in the sky. What? Some of the Shinigami staggered back. Because inside the Garganta were numerous Minos Grande, and behind them, something even larger. Before the Shinigami could even react, pillars of pale yellow enshrouded Shiro and the rest. Staring up at the Garganta, and then to the pillar of pale yellow now surrounding him at the others, Shiro clenched his fists. He was exhausted, but he couldn't show it. It was best this way to prevent the Shinigami from being able to measure his limits. And besides, Shiro's eyes narrowed towards the horizon where Sokioku Hill was located. He still needed answers from Aizen. Moments before, the land around was deathly silent aside from the ragged breathing of those nearby. Kyokaka was just barely holding on to consciousness, and she was currently using all her effort to glare at Byakuya. It wasn't that she had hated the man before, but what she couldn't forgive is what he did to her brothers. It was as if Byakuya had gone crazy after saving Rukia, attacking everyone else in the group systematically. Compared to Byakuya, no one was able to stop him, perhaps only Kayan, but he was wrapped in suppressants. This only made it all the more heart-wrenching when he tossed himself in front of her and Ganja when Byakuya came to attack them. Ganja was next to be defeated in a fit of rage, and she herself had partaken in it. However, no matter how angry she was, it was a fact that she couldn't amount to much against a captain-class Shinigami. She was thoroughly defeated, and when the blade's edge was descending on her, it was her younger brother who took the blow. Both of her brothers were stabbed straight through right in front of her eyes. Words couldn't even begin to describe how she felt staring at Byakuya's despondent face, as if he couldn't understand what it was that he had done. Vision blurring, the last thing she saw was Kayan's fingers twitching. Surprised, Captain Kukiki? I didn't think you would be so savage as to crush those weaker than you, Aizen spoke calmly. Silently, Byakuya's gaze fell upon the man he had thought he was fighting. What is this? He asked in a soft voice, laced within was a glacial fury that was near its tying point. Oh? You can't tell your own handiwork? Aizen said smiling. Then again, I suppose I can tell you now, but first a little matter to attend to. Byakuya's eyes widened when he realized that Rukia was no longer in his arms. By your expression, I think that you should rather ask yourself if she was ever in your hands in the first place. Aizen questioned slowly, Rukia held in his hands as he talked leisurely. Resisting the impulse to move, Byakuya forced himself to think. Nothing was making sense. Aizen's Zanpakuto was supposed to be of the water type, Byakuya had seen it himself. Clearly though, something was wrong with the situation. Kyoka Suijutsu, Aizen said while removing his brown-rimmed spectacles. It's not what it seems. Rather, it's a very special Zanpakuto. One with the power of complete hypnosis. Another Aizen suddenly appeared by Byakuya with a taunting expression. That water-type Zanpakuto was never real, Aizen explained. Shink. Senbonzakura sailed straight through Aizen, the Aizen before his eyes fading away. You're mad, I can tell. Who wouldn't after personally attacking his own sister? Shut up, Byakuya's words were frigid, his hands balled so tightly that the whites of his knuckles were showing. Pink sakura-like petals circled in a storm of miniature blades around Byakuya, threatening to explode out in all directions. Trying to weed me out by attacking everything around you? Aizen asked, not seeming fazed in the slightest. Or perhaps it's just to cover your own blind spots. In any case, are you really sure of that? Almost as soon as Aizen finished speaking, Byakuya got a clear view at what Aizen was staring at. Kyokaku and the rest. Moreover, Aizen said, reading Byakuya's facial expression. Is this Rukia in my hands the real Rukia, or is it the one you can't see lying near your feet? I dread to imagine what would happen if those sharp blades of yours were to accidentally sweep her up in the current. Byakuya's expression froze. This bastard. The flowing pink-colored petals ceased altogether, forming back into Senbonzakura's sword. Byakuya was at a loss about what to do. If Aizen indeed possessed complete hypnosis, then how could he be sure that he was attacking who he wanted to? He couldn't be certain of anything, therefore he had to trust in his own senses and judgment. But right now, despite the calmness of his face, his emotions were going haywire. More than anything, he wanted to strike Aizen down at this very moment, but he couldn't. Not with surety. Are we done, Captain Kukaki? Aizen asked. If so, it was admittedly an entertaining spectacle, but I'm afraid it has to end. Byakuya felt a cold sensation in his chest, only to realize that it was from the steel of a sword. This is where our time together ends, Captain, Aizen said while pulling out his blade. There was a squelching sound before blood began to spurt heavily into the air. Byakuya buckled onto his knees. He was still injured from the time he went to the human world and hadn't fully recuperated. Another injury was only bringing him closer to passing out. Yet he forced himself to remain awake long enough to see Aizen walking towards Rukia. At that moment, he knew that this had to be the real Rukia. Otherwise, why would Aizen continue to use his power on someone already beaten? Forcing strength into his body, he lashed out, seeming to catch Aizen by surprise. However, it was someone else who forcibly knocked him out. A hand appeared just off the edge of his vision, gauging a fissure across Byakuya's side. Who? Unable to maintain consciousness any longer, Byakuya collapsed on the ground. Aizen turned around to stare at Kaien Shiba flicking the blood away from his hands. Was the act necessary? Aizen asked offhandedly. Kaien didn't answer, instead scratching his head while his expression creased into a frown. I guess it doesn't really matter, but I suggest you go back to lying down. I sense others coming, Aizen spoke. Kaien nodded his head, and then resumed his earlier position. Now then, Aizen muttered while picking Rukia up by the scruff of her neck. Time to get matters underway. I don't think so, Aizen, a voice called approaching from the distance. Within seconds Yoriyuki burst out from the shrubs pulling Ichigo by the arm. Hey, that hurts. Ichigo complained, trying to get feeling back into his arm. Yet, at that very moment, he finally registered the scene Yoriyuki had brought him to. Karen. Everyone. Ichigo's expression grew panicked seeing their injured states. More so when his eyes landed on Aizen, who was still holding Rukia up. It became clear to him who had been the cause of all this. Anger nearly caused him to charge in, yet Yoriyuki forced him back. Don't. He's far stronger than whatever you are capable of right now, Yoriyuki warned. Just go get the others while I deal with him. Ichigo didn't like the feeling of helplessness that took root in him once again. It was why he had trained so hard after his defeat in the human world, and also his progress when he defeated Renji. To once again be unable to do anything, it almost too hard to accept. Gritting his teeth, Ichigo eventually relented when his need to make sure the others were okay overwhelmed his desire to avenge them. But still. What about Rukia? Ichigo said cautiously. Yoriyuki glanced at Ichigo, and seeing the determination in his eyes, could only motivate herself further. "Just leave it to me," she spoke again. Frowning, Ichigo eventually moved to help Karen and the rest. "You think you alone are enough?" Aizen asked when Yuriyuki approached. "Honestly," Yuriyuki said slowly. "No, but to get Rukia out of your hands, that I have confidence in." Chapter 27. They say that the strength of a man could be dictated by the size of his influence, or the means in which he could get a job done. To be strong, either by working around something, or forcibly intervening through physical means. Aizen Soushik was neither of those. But neither was he pragmatic, nor callous, just analytical in a cold sense. Everything could be viewed as if on a board, the players, chess pieces to be moved by a careful hand. The opposition to be defeated by a sound strategy, and this sort of ideology had never changed for him. In fact, it had only grown stronger. "How amusing," Aizen spoke offhandedly. His eyes were calm, and his disposition emitting a hidden pressure that caused Yuriyuki's eyes to narrow. "You are but one other person that wishes for my defeat, but pray tell how you intend to do so when I already have that which I desire in hand?" he asked. Rukia's unconscious form swayed with the slightest of his movements. Truly it was quite frail, and perhaps it would deteriorate completely should he unleash the full magnitude of his spiritual pressure. However, that wouldn't serve him any benefit before he could separate her from that which was within her. Although, it was at least fitting that there was some form of opposition. His eyes glanced past Yuriyuki, and towards the battle occurring in the sky, the fluctuations of spiritual energy hard to ignore when the air itself was already becoming humid. Truth be told, he wasn't that interested in mere changes of the air, rather, it was the display of abilities he was witnessing all this while. A deluge of swords and weapons that spontaneously manifested in the sky. That, and the expressions on the faces of the other captains and seated officers when their very own Zanpakuto were placed opposed to them. The irony. Swords meant to cleanse evil spirits pointed at the Shinigami themselves. He almost couldn't stop the twitch in his lip. What a splendid sight, but his attention would have to go to this woman for now, as again, it wouldn't be interesting without opposition. "Let's see what you've got, Kisuke Urahara." A smirk came to his face, eyes gleaming as he increased his grip on Rukia, causing a choked gargle to come from her mouth. "You bastard!" Ichigo yelled while checking on the condition of his friends. So, the boy spoke, but it was hardly worth paying attention to. Instead he goaded Yuriyuki. "Is she not still in my hands, Mrs. Shihoan?" He spoke candidly. The way her face twisted in contempt for his statement was a minor victory, but surely Urahara would have had briefed her on a strategy to deal with one such as himself. And indeed, Yuriyuki composed herself with a breath. Time ticked slowly, the influx of spiritual energy in the air only growing stronger, the scent of ash wafting throughout the forested region of Sokioku Hill casting a cloud of grey above. "Shall we begin then?" he said goadingly before drawing forth his sword. The stillness of a mirror's surface, or the sereneness of a tranquil pond, all is encaptured by the water's moon and the mirror's flower. Kyoka Suijutsu. The moment he uttered the name of his Zanpakuto was the moment Yuriyuki would lose her chance to do anything significant to him. From the start, he had already known that she had been wary of attacking him. After all, she wouldn't have had been sure if Kyoka Suijutsu had already been activated or not. If so, how could she be sure if the him before her was truly the him in front of her? Kyoka Suijutsu had the ability of complete hypnosis. Therefore, it was able to manipulate his enemies to see things that weren't there, hear things that weren't heard, and even feel things that weren't there. What is it that separates reality from illusion but a thin line? If one thinks something's real, and the world around them reciprocates to these thoughts, then doesn't that world become real? It's a thin line indeed, and more so when he could control everything that his opponent would ever sense. Therefore, the world he could create before their eyes was as real could ever be. Therefore, it came off as a bit of surprise when a blade nearly grazed his face while he was mockingly looking down on this woman. Tch, Yuriyuki clicked her tongue, but it didn't seem as if she realized she had almost cut him. He furrowed his brows and took a few steps back to observe. A coincidence? Looking at Yuriyuki, it didn't seem as if she was able to break out of his illusions, and even then, it would be a difficult endeavor. A battle between Shinigami was a battle between spiritual pressures, and his was enough to rival that of head captain Yamamoto. The only way she would get out of an illusion cast by Kyoka Suigesta was if she could overpower his own spiritual energy, or if he allowed her to. In which case, it was clear that she was incapable of the first option, but he didn't allow the second option of releasing her either. Then how was it possible that she had attacked in his direction? His lips thinned as he contemplated, watching as Yoriyuki reacted to the illusion he had already placed her in. She was attacking the area around her, her apparent lack of a sword making it appear as if she was shadow boxing. Yet, it was a dangerous sort of shadow boxing. Every fist and kick came with a sharpness that was able to cut the air itself, blades of wind creating fissures of splintered wood and gravel. Yoriyuki! A voice called out in confusion. He turned his attention momentarily to Ichigo, the boy who was now standing stupefied while watching the ongoing fight. Out of everyone in the Seirai, perhaps the only individuals who weren't affected by Kyoka Suigetsu could be counted on one hand, and Ichigo was included. Glancing back at Yoriyuki one last time, he determined that she was indeed still under Kyoka Suigetsu's effect, and thus sent a mocking stare in Ichigo's direction. "Well, boy," he said slowly, making his way towards Ichigo. "What will you do?" Even unconscious, Rukia's body seemed to react to his movements, her hands grasping at his that now held her up by the neck. Her complexion was also growing paler and paler by the second. Just a little more pressure and he could suffocate her, or perhaps snap the delicate thing entirely. Yet, he wouldn't do so. "Weren't you going to save her?" he asked, dangling Rukia forward like a doll. There was a sort of satisfaction that derived itself from his amusement when he noticed the fury rising over Ichigo's face. To think that a boy so weak could even think about opposing him, let alone saving the Kukaki in his hands. Veins bulged around Ichigo's face, and a red flush was spreading from the base of his neck. Even his muscles had become tense, his grip around that butcher-like Zanpakuto increasing until his knuckles turned white. As expected, Ichigo attacked. Aizen's expression gave nothing away even though this sequence of events was truly quite predictable. Putting strength into his sword, the thought of even using Kyoka Suigetsu on someone so weak never surfaced. "Let her go!" Ichigo yelled, cutting forward with his sword. Ripples formed in the air as the slash descended, but he knew it was time to show this disillusioned child what reality truly was. A single move, and the fluttering sound of his Haori. He stepped forward into Ichigo's slash, and even resheathed Kyoka Suigetsu in the process. What? Ichigo's expression seemed to say. Truly it was the expression of one who finally understood the exact situation. Ichigo's sword shook as the boy tried and failed to remove it from his one-handed grip. A futile endeavor as even now he was only using 2 fingers to keep it lodged in place. In the next instant, he applied pressure to his hand, and swiftly tossed that butcher-like sword aside and out of Ichigo's grip. Ichigo stood there blankly, but unexpectedly he quickly grabbed the white cloth secured to Zanjutsu's blade before swinging it in Aizen's direction. It was like a saw blade with how fast it moved, yet even then, nothing changed. Raising his hand, Aizen once again placed it in front of him to intercept the attack. Yet he winced in alarm. Grh! Blood seeped from the arm that had once held Rukia Kukaki, the red-colored liquid streaming to the ends of his fingers before dripping to the ground. Swerving left, he dodged Ichigo's attack before glaring impassively behind him. "You," he spoke in a hard tone. Yoriyuki stood before him, Rukia now in her possession as she smiled coyly. "Cat got your tongue, Aizen?" she asked while making sure that Rukia was secured in her arms. Aizen didn't utter a word. Instead he vanished. Yoriyuki's senses immediately went on overdrive. Aizen wasn't to be meddled with and his wits and means were nothing to be scoffed at. Shifting her weight between her feet, she yelled at Ichigo to retreat before she spun away from a sword's edge. Huffing, she glared at Aizen's impassive face before deciding on the best strategy. Back and forth she moved in bursts of flash steps, seeming to appear in multiple places at once. Yoriyuki Shihoin, the Flash Queen, said to have had been the fastest Shinigami in the Seirai. And this reputation was not undeserved. Using her speed, it would have had been impossible for anyone to keep track of her, but Aizen was different. "Damn monster," She pursed her lips as Aizen meticulously intercepted every single one of her blows, his hands seeming to move even before her attacks landed. "You are still in the illusion," Aizen's voice rang out in her ears, the tone perplexed. She paid it no mind and only continued to increase her speed to make it difficult for Aizen to pinpoint her. "It's clear in the way that your attacks are so predictable." Aizen's hand got hold of Yuryuki's outstretched leg from a kick and tossed her like a ragdoll. "Tell me, Ms. Shihoan, what is it that you see?" Yuryuki's eyes were bloodshot as she ruthlessly crashed against the ground, Rukia cradled in her arms to avoid hurting her. She blinked hard as the image of Urahara in front of her walked towards her. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet no matter what, a part of her was still holding itself back. Shit, she cursed herself and the situation she was in. She already secured Rukia, and she was confident in her ability to escape in one direction. No matter what illusion Aizen made her see, it wouldn't matter so long as she ran off in a straight line while eliminating all obstacles before her. It would then be a contest of speed, assuming Aizen would be able to keep up with her at maximum velocity. Yet she couldn't leave. Not when Ichigo and the rest would be left at Aizen's mercy. "Ichigo!" she called hastily, tossing Rukia at him. "Run, get out of here!" she ordered. "I'll keep Aizen busy." "Oh, is that so?" A hand clamped over Yuryuki's face before she felt the cold bite of a blade piercing her skin. Eyes widening, she muffled her scream, and forced away the feeling of pain in her body with her sheer will. Thereafter, her hands wrapped around Aizen's arm and twisted in opposite directions. The hand holding her was forced open as a result, and she once again began dashing across the area, looking for any openings. I can't just leave, damn it," Ichigo protested while holding gently to Rukia. "What about Chad, Orium, Ishida, Kyukaku, and the rest?" Yuryuki's expression grew complicated. "Just make sure Rukia's safe for now," she eventually muttered. Ichigo was left speechless, unable to decide about what to do. Aizen, however, paid this no attention, instead the entirety of his focus was on Yuryuki. He placed Kyuka Suijutsu by his side, before straightening his back to stand imposingly. "How?" he eventually asked Yuryuki. If Urahara had made it possible for others to be unaffected by Kyuka Suijutsu, then there was an immediate need to reconsider certain plans, and if necessary, modify them. Yuryuki grinned. "Dunno," she said vaguely. "What do you think?" Aizen didn't rise to the challenge, instead he seemed to come to his own conclusions moments later. "Instinct." Aizen mumbled in a sudden epiphany. "Got to say, as expected of someone of your reputation." Yuryuki's lips thinned, as Aizen was correct. In the entirety of her fight, she trusted nothing. Not the image of Kisuke she was placed against, not the sound of Aizen's approach, nor the obstacles in the world around her. Instead, everything relied on her acute intuition and instinct. If something felt wrong, then she would react accordingly. Allowing her to perceive that which could not be perceived with all her senses confused and receiving a stimulus that wasn't there. Yet only someone of her mastery may be able to pull such a thing off. It only made it slightly less difficult for her because she was familiar with Aizen's means. "However, Ms. Shihoan," Aizen spoke slowly. "You should understand that my main strength doesn't come from just my Zanpakuto." In an instant, Aizen's fist landed onto Yuryuki's gut before she could even react. Yuryuki gagged, dry heaving as all the wind was knocked out of her. Her face contorted as she tried and failed to swipe at Aizen. And it wasn't because she missed, rather, Aizen simply shrugged off her attack, his body immovable. "Instincts can only go so far when in the face of true strength," Aizen said callously. "And this is already the extent of your resistance." Pulling his fist back, Kyuka Suijutsu swung swiftly through the air as a spray of blood soaked the ground in a deep crimson. "Gah!" Ichigo coughed out blood, a gaping hole appearing in his side before he collapsed on the ground. Blood then began to pool. "Ichigo, Yuryuki's eyes widened. "A fool is what he is," Aizen spoke offhandedly before flicking the blood off of his sword in an almost practiced sort of motion. Ichigo couldn't even respond, the pain coursing through him almost unbearable. Yet still, he forced himself to remain conscious. "Now then," Aizen said. Before Yuryuki could even react, She was forced to grit her teeth in pain when Aizen stabbed his sword through her leg. "Well, that settles that problem," he said nonchalantly. "Now why don't you just sit there obediently while I settle some matters?" Finishes speaking, Aizen disregarded both Yoriyuki and Ichigo before instantly appearing next to where Ichigo left Rukia sitting with her back supported by a tree. "Stop," Ichigo said. Yet those words would fall on deaf ears. It was with a quick motion that Ichigo stared in both shock and anger as Aizen raised Rukia off the ground, and stabbed a hand into her chest. "Aig!" Despite being unconscious, Rukia's eyes flickered open as she screamed in an untold amount of pain, the paleness of her body only becoming paler as she grew deathly still in the next moment. Of small stature in the first place, that tiny figure only seemed to become less noticeable as her body hunched, propped up by the hand stabbed within her. "No, no!" Ichigo's hands balled into fists before he attempted to force himself to his feet. Yet even if he did so, it was impossible to make it in time. Blood rushed up into his mouth, and he ended up hacking in a fit of coughs as a result. Aizen pulled his hand out of Rukia's chest and dropped her like a sack of potatoes against the ground, completely disregarding her for the pearl-like jewel he now had in hand. The Hogyaku, a purple orb said to be able to dissolve the boundaries between Shinigami and Hollow, allowing one race to attain the powers of the other. And with it, an unimaginable surge in power. "Aizen!" Yoriyuki roared, launching herself forward through the air. Even if one leg was injured, she had multiple techniques to compensate. If she couldn't rely on her legs, then she would use the speed of a sudden burst in spiritual energy to propel herself forward almost like a jet. A torrent of spiritual energy trailed behind her, and as she neared Aizen, another torrent shifted her trajectory as she lashed out with a spinning kick. Yet, Yoriyuki! It was too sudden, the sound of the air vibrating drowning out anything else as an azure beam of spiritual energy engulfed Yoriyuki entirely. Shadows flashed at that instant before even they were snuffed out by the radiance. In its wake, a smoking body flew across the air, the scent of charred skin wafting into the surroundings as Ichigo watched dazed while Yoriyuki's body tumbled across the ground. It wouldn't be until she crashed back first into the trees that she would stop. Aizen momentarily paused in his actions of examining the Hogyaku, before resuming with the calmness that was displayed in his actions. He then nodded his head in a certain direction that Ichigo quickly glanced at. Ichigo's eyes dilated, and mouth going dry, as his breathing grew more ragged from the rapid beating of his heart. His body's will to live was quickly kicking in, but more than that was the fluctuations in his emotions. The injuries he had already sustained only grew worse with his action, but he could hardly notice despite the pain assailing his mind. After all, just near the edge of the forest's clearing, the steady sound of footsteps could be heard as Starkey and Lilynet appeared in view. Lilynet refused to meet Ichigo's gaze as she cast her eyes downward, while Starkey still had a hand outstretched and sizzling with the remnants of the Zero just fired. "Why?" Ichigo's eyes seemed to say in Lilynet's mind, but she knew that answering would get her nowhere. To start with, both she and Starkey already knew Aizen, and knew that Aizen should be a Shinigami that was helping Shiro. Seeing Aizen get attacked, it was only natural for Starkey to fire. Only, the sight both she and Starkey walked into was not something that they expected. From a distance, Starkey had already been able to sense both Aizen's and Yoriyuki's spiritual pressures clashing, and as such intervened hoping that this entire ordeal would be over with. However, buried beneath both Aizen's and Yoriyuki's spiritual energy was Ichigo's. And now, seeing the situation as it was, Starkey drew back his hand, and decided to just watch. From Lilynet's reaction, she probably wouldn't want to go against Ichigo, but neither could Starkey help him either as he owed Aizen a favor for the actions of one of his subordinates, Araniro in the human world. At most, Starkey could just save Ichigo's life assuming Aizen didn't go too far. Yet, Starkey could already tell that Aizen had no intention of killing Ichigo. It was evident in how dismissively Aizen was treating him. This caused Starkey to release a small sigh of relief, at least it would mean less trouble for him. Then why was Ichigo staring in his direction so glaringly? Ichigo's eyes were bloodshot and piercing even though it was clear that the boy was fighting to stay conscious. Blood only continued to pool more quickly beneath the black robes, making it even crazier when Ichigo suddenly forced himself up onto his feet. The cut Aizen had made on him earlier had nearly bisected him, leaving a glaring hole in his side. Yet he stood up anyway. Ichigo, Lilynet called in concern. Ichigo swayed, his steps unsteady, but he silently clambered onward. Only the sound of his breathing echoed in the area. A man and his will to move forward. A will that cannot be impeded by even the most grueling of obstacles. For it was one to protect, yet was filled with equal amounts of longing and anguish. Aizen rose a brow, but only watched now that he already possessed the Hogyaku in hand. Rukia lay unmoving by his side. Lilynet's expression faltered, unsure of what to do as Ichigo slowly but surely made his way towards her and Starkey. It was only Starkey himself who realized that Ichigo's attention was not directed at them, but at the person Starkey held in his free arm. Silent. Starkey had found her in that cave at the cliff face of Sokioku Hill, and many other things which caused him to look at Aizen in a new light. Yet, now wasn't the time. Ichigo continued forward, butcher-like Zanpakuto trailing against the ground attached to a thin white cloth that clung to Ichigo's arm. Not only would such a thing weigh him down, but it only served to further open his wounds. It wouldn't be long before he would pass out from blood loss. Sure enough, he collapsed because of his injuries. Yet still, those hands continued to fumble forward, looking for purchase before dragging an injured body closer and closer. But even then, it wasn't enough. Ichigo lay 10 meters in front of Starkey and Lilynet, unmoving. Just from appearances alone, it was clear that Ichigo had finally passed out. Starkey, Lilynet said uncertainly. She hopped off of Starkey's grip and stared up at Starkey pleadingly. Starkey only shook his head though, there was nothing that he could do anyway, and Ichigo was still breathing despite passing out. Therefore, he turned his attention to Aizen before yawning, a hand over his mouth. If your business is done, I'd much prefer to return now, Starkey spoke while readjusting his grip on Silent. Though, there is something I want to ask you. Oh. Aizen spoke after pocketing the Hogyaku into his Haori. That captain, the one with the painted face, where is he? There was a seriousness in Starkey's tone that caused Lilynet to startle, but her attention was still elsewhere. She tugged on Starkey's sleeve, but Starkey ignored it, his attention on Aizen. Captain Mayuri Kuratsuke, then, Aizen said slowly. Indeed, he has been quite absent from this entire matter, hasn't he? There was a knowing expression on Aizen's face when he spoke. Starkey took note of this. Therefore, Starkey asked again. Where is he? He asked. Lilynet's tugging was becoming fiercer, but Starkey still ignored it. Knowing Lilynet, it was probably something irrelevant anyway. Aizen didn't answer right away, instead, his gaze seemed to stare past Starkey with interest. Starkey furrowed his brows, somewhat frustrated that he was being ignored, and his question put aside. Still, as a sudden wind blew his bangs across his face, it was then that he felt an oppressive spiritual pressure emitting from beside him. And only then did he realize that Lilynet had resorted to punching him to gain his attention, the sudden soreness of his stomach causing him to frown in displeasure. Staring down at Lilynet, he ignored her actions and instead stood bewildered by what he then saw when he shifted his gaze. A hollow is a soul born from regrets and longing, along with the degradation of one's soul chain. So why then, was a Shinigami emitting the presence of a hollow? Wisps of dark red and black were stirring around Ichigo in a vortex-like storm, the man himself staggering onto his feet. Bits of white paste formed from thin air, condensing around Ichigo's head before a hollow's howl echoed throughout the area. Starkey, look. Lilynet spoke excitedly. Slowly, but visibly, a hollow's mask began appearing over Ichigo's face, his skin shifting to a pale white. Not only was Lilynet stunned, but a part of her felt euphoric. She actually enjoyed spending her time with Ichigo, partly because there was always something to entertain her, but more because of the way he treated her. It made her feel human, a feeling that she didn't think that she would ever be able to understand. Starkey, let's take him back to Hueco Mundo, Lilynet spoke excitedly as she tugged Starkey by the scruff of his neck. Yet Starkey would quickly put a stop to it. Lilynet, Starkey said, placing a hand over Lilynet's own and removing himself from Lilynet's grip. Something about Starkey's gaze caused Lilynet to falter and stare up at him confusedly. Get back, Lilynet, Starkey said, suddenly pushing Lilynet behind him. The sudden action elicited a shriek of surprise from Lilynet's, but Starkey didn't care. Instead, both he and Aizen stared silently as a white liquid spurted out from Ichigo's wounds and covered them. Moments later, the substance disappeared to reveal unblemished pale skin. High-speed regeneration, a common trait amongst hollows. And it appeared in a Shinigami. Moments later, a pair of black scleras zeroed in on Starkey, faded yellow pupils screaming of violence in a maniacal gleam. How troublesome! The moments those words were uttered, was the moment Starkey moved into action. He hoisted Lilynet over his shoulder and instantly backpedaled as a crater formed where he once was. Seemingly from out of nowhere, a bestial snarl reverberated throughout the surrounding smoke knocked up from the explosion of the attack. Starkey, what's happening? Lilynet asked as her gaze darted around. Not now, Lilynet, Starkey said gruffly before placing a hand on Lilynet's head and pressing her close as he maneuvered away from the rising smoke. The sound of Lilynet's muffled protest entered Starkey's ears, but he was far from able to even notice them. This spiritual pressure. Starkey furrowed his brows in thought, face growing increasingly solemn. It was simply because the spiritual pressure only seemed to be increasing with time. Moreover, just from the feel of it, he knew of its source. Damn it, Lilynet, always causing trouble. The spiritual energy was unmistakably of the same type as the one Lilynet had infused along with his help when Ichigo was first injured. Starkey was confused before as to how Ichigo could absorb a hollow's spiritual energy, but now, he would no longer have to think about such an issue. Starkey swerved, eyes narrowing as a clawed appendage made to grab at the people he was holding close with his hands. Spiritual energy was coalescing around it such that it was forming the vague image of a zero. It won't be that easy, sorry, Starkey spoke as he twisted his legs and shifted his trajectory using a burst of spiritual energy at his feet to negate the blast about to form from the incoming hand. Starkey, let go of me already, Lilynet protested, wiggling her head such that she had enough room to glare up. Subsequently, her gaze landed on the figure attacking Starkey as the smoke cleared. It was lizard-like. A hollow with a flowing mane of orange hair that stretched all the way down to its clawed feet. Tribal markings much like Shiro's ran across the arms and legs, but the thing was, parts of the hollow still showed human characteristics. The chest, for example, was still a pale tan, and only one of the arms had fully transformed. Ichigo. Lilynet called out carefully. Her only response was a roar before Starkey pulled her close again to maneuver away from the rampaging beast. Has he lost his mind? Starkey asked rhetorically as he felt a headache coming. This was more trouble than it was worth. Stepping past a kick, Starkey shifted his stance to point the broken half-maw of his hollow mask towards Ichigo, and then formed a massive zero that dyed the entire forest blue. Lilynet's eyes widened seeing Starkey do such an action. No. Stop, Starkey, stop. She immediately began protesting Starkey's actions to the point where she began beating at his side. Damn it, Lilynet, Starkey said exasperatedly. What the hell do you want me to do then? Take a beating? I'd rather not, thank you. Lilynet's expression sank, unable to come up with an answer. Then again, Ichigo wouldn't even give her any time to come with anything. Attacking once more, the spiritual energy around Ichigo only continued to skyrocket, such that Starkey was beginning to feel a slight tingle over his skin. The sensation was similar to a person walking through a cloud of mist, able to feel the moisture of the water vapor in the air, but the water vapor unable to do anything else. Unlike water vapor though, the feeling wasn't really refreshing. Instead, there was sort of malevolence within that Starkey and Lilynet knew all too well. Ajich's level, Starkey observed from the growing spiritual energy forming a storm around Ichigo, who halted in place and was groaning while grabbing at his head. Starkey once again furrowed his brows before scratching irritably at his head. The situation just didn't make any sense. Sure, he and Lilynet had given Ichigo a substantial amount of a hollow's spiritual energy, but the amount he could still feel growing from within Ichigo was more than what he remembered giving. It was almost as if Ichigo actually was a hollow. But that didn't make sense. Lilynet said he was a human. Then he was a Shinigami. And now he was a hollow? What kind of acquaintance did Lilynet make? Still, with both of his arms holding one person each, Starkey only had his legs and zeros to fend off Ichigo with. But to make matters worse, Lilynette was protesting to him about striking Ichigo with a zero. After all, his strongest zeros were fired from the very half-maw of his hollow mask dangling just beneath his collar. Not to brag, but if he fired a fully charged shot with it, it could probably reduce the entire Seirei into rubble, assuming all of its defenses were gone. Lilynette clearly had a grasp of this fact, as she was vehemently prohibiting its use. However, she still didn't come up with a solution either. "What a pain," Starkey drawled tiredly. "Hey you," he called to Ichigo. Ichigo didn't answer through the vortex of energy surrounding him, but Starkey did notice that Ichigo's gaze was on him. "Why don't you attack him instead?" Starkey pointed to Aizen, who had shifted several paces away and was observing the battle quietly. "Why would you attack me when I just got here? Hell, I didn't even do anything to you. So, would you give me a break please?" The only response to Starkey's question was a rush attack. There was no finesse involved, and nothing to truly describe it in words, but the land itself seemed to tear open with every step. The situation only became worse when Ichigo tugged lightly at the white cloth wrapped around his right arm, and that butcher knife-like sword made its reappearance. "Lilynette dash. No, don't even think about it." Lilynette was still adamant about not hurting Ichigo. Just pin him down and let me think." "And let me think," she said. Starkey's brows twitched as the zero he wanted to charge dwindled down with Lilynette's words. He was truly feeling frustrated at this moment. He was lazy by his own personality, and Lilynette expected him to take a long approach to subdue Ichigo rather than blast him and hope he was still alive. This was already too much of a hassle for him to have ever volunteered for, yet he couldn't go against Lilynette's wishes. It wasn't that he couldn't, it was just that she truly did look conflicted. Even if he didn't show it, one of the things he could actually motivate himself to work for was for Lilynette's own happiness. And this was one of those times. A zero appeared in his chest before blasting forward and engulfing Ichigo within. "Starkey!" Lilynette yelled in outrage. "Relax, I minimized the power," Starkey said gruffly before dashing into the smoke produced. From the rising spiritual pressure, Starkey could detect Ichigo's position within the smoke clearly. Whereas Ichigo couldn't do the same. After all, Starkey was suppressing his presence. He was like a bullet, zipping through the air and displacing all in his way. Ichigo appeared in sight almost instantly, and at the same time Ichigo reacted as Starkey appeared. Howling, that butcher knife-like sword whirled in a circular motion of death. There was even the sound of the air buzzing as the sword moved as fast as a spinning saw blade. Starkey's eyes narrowed into slits before he halted his charge by digging his feet into the ground and twisting his ankles to shift his direction. The whirling butcher knife-like sword sailed past, and at that instant, Starkey made his move. He dashed directly forward, clashing against Ichigo's body in less than a second before his legs clamped around Ichigo's chest and twisted. Ichigo roared as he tumbled to the ground face first, but even then, Starkey wasn't going to let the opportunity go. Pressing down a foot over Ichigo's back, Starkey applied pressure and cratered the ground beneath, imprinting Ichigo's image before pinning him there by applying a deluge of spiritual energy. Lilynette quickly clambered off of Starkey while taking Silent into her arms. Thus, Starkey now had his arms free to further immobilize Ichigo. Despite Ichigo already being subdued, Starkey's expression wasn't one of victory, instead, it was one of increasing seriousness. "It's still growing." The spiritual pressure exuding from Ichigo was finally beginning to have some weight in it, and even presently, Ichigo was furiously hammering at the ground to find purchase. "Why can't you just stay down for now?" Starkey complained. "Ichigo, hey Ichigo, it's me." Lilynette tried waving her hand in front of Ichigo's face. Unexpectedly though, Ichigo actually stopped. A smug expression appeared on Lilynette's face as she stared gloatingly at Starkey. She then crossed her arms and grinned. "I told you I could come up with something," Lilynette said. Starkey only shook his head. "Idiot," he spoke, causing a vein to appear over Lilynette's brow. "Yeah, well you're a bigger idiot," Lilynette rebutted. Starkey only shook his head in exasperation before using a free hand to shift Lilynette's gaze to the left. "Oh," Lilynette said softly, looking at the sight before her. Ichigo's eyes were transfixed on Silent, the raging spiritual energy rising from within Ichigo suddenly halting. Get out, out, Ichigo was muttering as a hand was tearing away at the mask on his face. Yet when the mask wouldn't tear off right away, Ichigo just stared forward motionless. Thereafter, a mournful howl echoed from Ichigo's mouth while he slowly reached a hand forward to grab onto Silent's hand. Mom. The voice that came out was barely a whisper, something that even Starkey and Lilynet couldn't hear despite their close proximity. But actions were enough. Both Starkey and Lilynet grew quiet staring at the sight before them. It was a tender sort of moment, the kind only found between close relatives. Tears could be seen pooling from out of a Hollow's eyes. A Hollow's eyes. Ichigo's. It was the kind of emotion Starkey and Lilynet didn't think that they had ever felt. Slowly, steadily, Ichigo's hands clasped tightly onto ones that were so familiar, yet not. Sorry, I'm so sorry, the voice that came out was weak and brittle, as if the slightest impact could break it. It was all my fault. The area lapsed into a calm quiet, the sound of muffled sobs escaping Ichigo's mouth. Ichigo had once made a vow to never cry anymore. To always remain strong, and protect those who he considers friends and family. It was to the extent that he wanted to live up to his name as the protector. In memory of the one who protected him. He who protects others is one who is the most caring of all. There is no reason for it. No justification. But for Ichigo, it wasn't only about himself, it was for redemption, and to live up to the memory of the woman who raised him. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Ichigo repeated again, his grip slackening as he was slowly losing consciousness, but even then, he held on. Afraid. Afraid that if he'd closed his eyes, the woman before him would disappear just as she had on that day. Even then, there was still Rukia and the others. He couldn't give up, but he wouldn't allow himself to be controlled either. Out, get out. I don't need your power. His intentions were conveyed within his mind, and a scathing voice was his only reply. You're nothing without me. Gritting his teeth, Ichigo could still feel that malevolent power swirling from within him, but he dared not use it. It would only allow the bastard within him to take control again. Ichigo. Lilynet called. Ichigo was too tired to even lift his head. Luckily, he didn't have to shift his gaze too much to notice Aizen in the distance. Bastard, he cursed. Rukia was now laid prone on the ground along with the rest of his friends. He needed to make sure that they were safe, but in that moment, he caught something flash across his eyes. Well, isn't this a surprise? Aizen spoke. Yuriuki's hands shook just centimeters away from Aizen's face. Aizen himself was grasping at Yuriuki's arms, preventing her from pulling them back. Crawled from the grave, I see, Aizen said impassively. Well, no matter, my purposes here are done anyway. A tear ripped itself across the sky as a yellow and square beam of light descended down from the sky. Yuriuki's eyes widened as she immediately distanced herself from Aizen as the beam of light completely entrapped him within. This was true for both Starkey and Lilynet as well. Slowly, Aizen began ascending towards the sky, pulled up by the beam of light originating from the Minos Grande peeking their head through the crack above. Negation, a Minos Grande's unique skill to rescue their comrades. It was a square beams which engulfed the target in a light which completely isolates them from the dimension they are currently in, making it impossible to harm them from the outside of the pillar. Until next time, Ms. Shihoan, Aizen spoke. Yuriuki could only grit her teeth in response, the frustration of failure hard to swallow. This was even more so when she considered what Aizen was going to potentially do. However, her attention was again shifted at the next moment. Oi Starkey, look. Lilynet spoke excitedly, her voice carrying in the wind. Ichigo's coming too. Yuriuki's eyes widened when her ears heard those words. Swerving her head, it was only to see Ichigo floating off the ground while still holding onto Silent's hand. Shit, Yuriuki cursed. It was clear that the Jillians above assumed that Ichigo was a hollow like them. The spiritual energy lingering on him was that of a hollow's after all. Punching the ground, Yuriuki ignored her injuries as she considered what it was that she was going to have to tell Kisuke. Moreover, her gaze landed on Orium and the others before turning solely onto Karen. What was she going to tell her? And what would Asahine do as a result? Just thinking about those questions gave her a headache. Damn it, Ichigo! She cursed. Rangiku didn't know what to think when square beams of light began descending from the sky. More so when they began enclosing hollow after hollow within. Was this battle ending? The relief she felt was almost enough to weaken her knees. Toshiro was in dire need of medical attention, and the situation would have had only gotten worse if this continued. These beams of light suddenly shooting down from the sky, and stopping the hollows was like a godsend. It only took mere moments before every hollow was taken up into the skies and into the crack where the Minos were. Even that King of Hollows and the other Vasto Lords were no exception. Baragan, who had been trapped in the flames, included. It was truly a miracle. Yet, Rangiku's mindset of the matter shattered the moment one of those beams of light engulfed Jinichi Maru. She felt a coldness well from within her at that moment. What was going on? Her legs carried her forward, but by the time she reached her destination it was already too late. Jijin. She called towards the sky. This couldn't be happening. Always leaving without a word. Leaving her behind. Jin. She called out again helplessly. Rangiku. Jin shuddered as he heard Rangiku's shouts, yet he didn't move. The constant smile on his face never changing. Although, he would be lying if he said that it wasn't strained at this point in time. Jin turned to face Rangiku before bowing his head. "I'm sorry," was all that he said before his attention shifted towards the head commander and the other captains that were staring hard at him. This was the same for Kaname, who was in the same boat. "Jinichi Maru, Kaname-tuan, what is the meaning of this?" Yamamoto's tone was hard as the flames around him increased in intensity from his anger. "For justice," Kaname spoke. Yet different from Kaname, who voiced this response to Saijin Komamura, Jin had nothing to say. Therefore, the only parting sentiments Jin could give was smile, impossible to discern. Yet if one looked close enough, they would be able to see the blood Jin was drawing from his hands due to the intensity of his own grip. "Kaname, wait." "Jin." Both Rangiku and Saijin rushed up towards Kaname and Jin, unable to accept what was going on. However, nothing they did could breach the light surrounding the two. Enough, any attempt to capture them was over the moment the beam of light surrounded them. "They are already out of our reach," Yamamoto said gruffly. "Jinichi Maru, Kaname-tuan, do not regret your actions of today." With that said, Yamamoto sheathed his sword before staring intently at the crack in the sky that was already closing. This King of Hollows, he would be a troublesome enemy indeed. The war with the Quincy's of the old era, this King of Hollows gave him a similar impression of strength as that ruler of Quincy's. Yet now, Yamamoto had already grown old. Only time will tell what the future may bring, but for now, there was a more pressing question. What had happened to the captain of Squad 12 and Saoshikaisen? Not once had he shown up on the battlefield. While pondering on this question, Yamamoto began ordering for the cleanup of the area, all the while Rangiku stared blankly up in the sky in a daze. Toshiro was critically injured, and now even Jin had left her once again. Falling onto her knees, she hugged herself with her arms as she sobbed silently. A strong-willed woman who Jin believed would only grow stronger with time. For her, he would claim back what was stolen even if it meant condemning himself. When the last of the hollows appeared within Hueco Mundo once more, a cheer resounded in the space as they recalled the state that the Siratii was in when they left. This excitement only grew stronger when they recalled the power Shiro had displayed. Yet for others, it only served to foster more bitterness. Baragan was beyond simply frustrated. He had been caged in that damnable fire. No matter how much he'd aged the flames to burn away, new flames continued to burn from the ashes of the old in a never-ending cycle. It was truly too infuriating. Having lived the majority of his life with no life form able to resist his power, he had thought that the sole exception would be a hollow as strong as himself, but to have a Shinigami do the same? It was humiliating. Baragan quickly left the area, with his army, unable to bear the humiliation he assumed he would perceive from Shiro's eyes. Yet contrary to belief, Shiro was not in any way happy. He was actually somewhat mournful. From the number of hollows that had come with him, several dozen would never return. And the weight of that statement would forever remain within him. Not once would he ever forget those who fought alongside him. Eyes gazing across the crowd of hollows around him, it was to see a commotion occurring around Aizen and two other captains that were beside him. Just as Shiro was about to make his way towards Aizen to discuss a few matters about where Silent was, but before he could do that, Starkey suddenly appeared in front of him. Lilynet was nowhere in sight, but Shiro had grown used to Starkey's habit of ditching Lilynet somewhere safe before finding a spot to relax by himself. Generally, that spot involved a nice plot of sand. Preferably a small dune by Starkey's tastes that he would depress into a bed using his body's weight. But more to the point, Starkey didn't seem to be looking for such a place to relax. Instead, Starkey was staring straight at him. "Is there something wrong?" he asked, bewildered. The Starkey he knew would have long since been relaxing by now. "I found Silent," Starkey said. "She's safe, so no need to worry." Starkey spoke out once again before Shiro could voice anything. Closing his mouth, Shiro gave a sigh of relief. At least Aizen had made good on the deal to get every living hollow out safely from the Siriti. Speaking of which, he still had to talk with the man. Starkey noticed his intention. "If you do go," Starkey said slowly, recalling what he had seen within the cave at Sokioku Hill. "Be wary of Aizen Saushik." Chapter 28, A Snake Hiding in the Shadows. There were only two things that crossed her mind when Karen first regained consciousness. One was panic, and the other was a sense of dejection. However, it didn't hit her that something was wrong until she noticed the despondent expression on Kyokaku and Ganju's faces, who were recuperating in a bed near her. Other than despondence, she couldn't help but shiver when she noticed the cold glare Kyokaku was directing towards Byakuya Kukaki, who lay prone on another bed in the medical ward. It was almost as if Kyokaku was on the verge of doing something unthinkable. She herself would probably be in a similar state should she realize what exactly had happened, but for now, she was just relieved that her friends were safe. Chad, Orium, and Ishida were all resting around her with bandages over their wounds as they slept on their own mattresses. As it stood now, she was the first to awaken from her group aside from Kyokaku and Ganju. Groaning, she felt a tightness around her head and realized that it was thoroughly bandaged when she felt it up with her fingers. Her actions, however, were clearly noticed by Kyokaku, who glanced in her direction. "What happened?" she ventured, seeing that she had Kyokaku's attention. A glimmer of something appeared over Kyokaku's face, but she apparently didn't have the heart to answer. "He's gone," Ganju said. "When we woke up, he was gone." She furrowed her brows in displeasure. Ganju wasn't making any sense to her. Unless he specified who exactly was gone, then how was she supposed to know who was missing? Then again, she clearly couldn't see that Kyan fellow in the room. Even Rukia was present, placed to rest on her own bed. That connection she made was all it took to understand the current situation and just why Kyokaku was regarding Byakuya with such animosity. If it weren't for Byakuya attacking everyone, then how could everyone possibly be knocked unconscious? Truth be told, she too was greatly frustrated at the man, and similarly gave him a harsh glare, the appearance of which resembled Kyokaku's to a letter. There really was too much of a resemblance, and even though both Ganju and Kyokaku could pick up on it, they weren't in the mood to bring the matter up. The gentle sound of water trickling down bamboo pipes filtered into her ears as the sliding door of the room creaked open. A black cat wandered in, and based on the way it sat in front of Byakuya to shield him from Kyokaku's glare, it had something to say. "There's more to this situation than what you believe it to be," Yoriyuki spoke. The tone of Yoriyuki's voice was flat, the seriousness in it causing Kyokaku's mouth to curve into a sneer. "Then what can I take it as?" Kyokaku spat venomously. "Kyan was here, Yoriyuki. He was alive, and if it weren't for this bastard of captain who couldn't distinguish enemy from ally, then he may still be here." The raising of Kyokaku's voice was met with Yoriyuki's unmoving gaze. "It wouldn't have mattered if Byakuya attacked you or not, you still wouldn't have been able to keep him," Yoriyuki spoke. Kyokaku lost her glare, but the way Kyokaku's hands balled into fists were enough indication that Kyokaku was nearing a breaking point. And seeing this, she who had been keeping silent grew nervous while watching the interaction. "Kyan Shiba is dead. The man you saw is no longer the same Shinigami you called brother. Listen, Kyokaku, I'm telling this to you as a friend, but he along with Saushikaizen, Jin Ichimaru, and Kaname-tuan were enveloped in the light of negation. He was a hollow." Kyokaku fell silent, the sound of Kyokaku's teeth grinding together. Finally, Kyokaku spoke. "I already knew that, Kyokaku admitted. I read it in the reports and heard it firsthand from Captain Yukate's mouth about what happened before Kyan was presumed dead. A hollow had merged with his body and presumably took over his soul. Kyan even admitted that he was no longer the same when I tried to rescue him, revealing that he was already part hollow. But Yoryuki, if his mind was truly corrupted by a hollow, then why then would he willingly offer his life to be forfeit through execution by the Sokyoku? A fierceness appeared over Kyokaku's face as she stared unflinchingly at Yoryuki. Why then would he take that bastard of Captain's blade through the chest just to protect Ganju and myself? Look around you, Yoryuki, Ganju and myself are the least injured here, and it was because he bled for us in the front. Kyokaku paused, Kyokaku's brows furrowing in confliction. You called him a hollow, Yoryuki, but hollow or not, the actions he took couldn't have had been an act. Yoryuki sighed. If that is truly so, then perhaps he is just another victim of a particular case. I'm sure that you've heard about what happened to the last captains of several decades ago, Kyokaku. Kyokaku nodded. By now, it almost seemed as if both Yoryuki and Kyokaku had forgotten that she and Ganju were in the room. Then again, she wouldn't interrupt because she had no idea about what was being discussed. Captains that were banished for their involvement with hollows, Kyokaku muttered as Yoryuki finished speaking. Then if what you said is true, Yoryuki, then it means that Kyan may be the same. Yoryuki nodded. There is a possibility, but even then, what can we do knowing that? The hollow's negation should have had mistakenly locked onto Kyan, and because of this, he could be anywhere in Hueco Mundo. Hearing this, the pipe in Kyokaku's left hand shattered from the grief felt at that moment. Ganju was quick to console. She herself was just about to offer some words, but she froze in her actions when she realized that Yoryuki's gaze landed on her. There was just something about Yoryuki's gaze that caused her to have a bad premonition. As a result, she remained still when Kyokaku pushed Ganju aside and hobbled out of the room under the protests of Squad 4's members. With a small clack, both Ganju and Kyokaku had left the room, leaving her behind to deal with Yoryuki. Why yes. She couldn't help but stammer. It was only then that she realized that she probably would have had been better off if she had pretended to be asleep. At least then Yoryuki wouldn't be staring at her so intently. In this regard, she even grew a tad jealous at the only other boy around her age unconscious in the room. This boy had spiky silver hair that flowed over his forehead like thick bangs, and he was completely covered in bandages. Unlike everyone else in the room, this boy was the only one to be showing an expression of pain on his face as he slept. This gave her second thoughts about even thinking of being in his position. Thus, she steeled herself and stared nervously at Yoryuki, waiting for the cat to speak its mind. Kyan Shiba wasn't the only one to be enveloped by negation, Yoryuki began. And I know that you may not know what negation is, but all you need to understand is that it's a method for hollows to rescue each other even in different dimensions. Okay. Her answer was disinterested, but she couldn't help it. Her sole reason for coming to the Soul Society was to make sure Ichigo was safe, and to save her mother. Anything else was only a passing concern as the people she had come with were all injured but fine nonetheless. Her brows twitched in the next moment. Everyone was injured but fine. Her eyes darted across the room, a sinking feeling taking root within her. Where was Ichigo? I know one of the reasons you and Ichigo came to the Soul Society isn't just because you wanted to save Rukia Kukaki, but because you wished to save someone else. Masaka Kurosaki. Yoryuki said that name as a statement. Karen's breath hitched as a result. You know something? She immediately pressed. Why else would Yoryuki bring up such a matter? A moment passed in which Yoryuki only stared silently at Karen. This is going to sound terrible to you, but I'm afraid that this is the truth seen with my own eyes. Yoryuki moved away from her position near Byakuya and slowly walked onto Karen's bedside. Your mother Masake, and brother Ichigo, were enveloped in the negation's beams. When those words entered Karen's ears, she didn't know how to react. Then when she recalled the conversation Yoryuki had with Kyokaku earlier and the words Yoryuki had spoken, her expression shifted into hysterics. On top of her concern, she didn't know how she was going to explain this to Yuzu and her father. We have to go after them, she stammered out, eyes beginning to moisten with tears. It was seeing Yoryuki shaking her head though caused them to fall without her knowing. Even if we wanted to, where would we look? There's no way that we can find their exact location. Even more concerning is that the head captain still hasn't come to a decision about your forced entry into the Siridi. Leaving now may have more demerits than benefits. Karen was a stubborn girl, and when she heard Yoryuki's rebuttals, she paid them no regard. I still have to try because Ichigo would do the same for me, she said. Pulling the bed covers off of her, she intended to push herself out of the bed, but winced from the sudden pain of the action. And you intend to go in your state? The question unnerved Karen, who looked down at her own body. It was battered and bruised, thick blotches of purplish pigmentations running across both her arms and legs. It was then that she realized that she had to be thankful for her father for being such an idiot to attack his own daughter. If not, her constitution wouldn't be as good as it was now. Regardless, the pain she felt with every movement was already debilitating, and she knew that Yoryuki had picked up on it. Frowning, but helpless, she could only stare vacantly at Yoryuki. I can work something out, Karen muttered, unwilling to back down. Yoryuki shook her head. You will die with that kind of mentality. More than that, Karen Kurosaki, are you strong enough to achieve anything? Yoryuki said with a raised brow. What if you yourself become the one that needs to be saved? I don't suppose your father would take the loss of 2 of his children very well. It was an understatement and Yoryuki knew it. Ishine had already lost Masaki, there was no telling what the man would do when Kisuke eventually informed him of what happened with Ichigo. To have Karen leave in pursuit, Ishine would come to look for trouble with her and Kisuke before recklessly charging into Hueco Mundo. By then, there was no controlling the ex-captain of Squad 10. Furthermore, even if Kisuke would be willing to open a portal into Hueco Mundo, the hollows Karen would have to face there were beyond just simply strong. They were on an entirely different level. The Vasto of White himself had become something of a celebrity within the Siridi. He was infamous as the hollow with the highest priority to kill. The extent of the Vasto of White's power could even still be seen and felt. The wasteland she had seen near the first's barracks were enough of an indication to cause her hairs to stand on end. More so when she considered another aspect of this famed Vasto Lord. The injuries he had inflicted on others didn't heal normally. Well, at least for the ones injured with that red spear. Captain Hichugiya was a prime example. Even now, the wound over his chest had yet to close. No amount of healing Ryotsu would seal it, forcing Captain Anohana to resort to thick bandages in hopes that the wound would mend by itself. The process of which even Anohana had no idea how long it would take. It was later through analyzing the wound that everyone realized that the spear used by the Vasto of White was imbued with a special property like a curse. This was the reason no healing Ryotsu would affect the wound. And Karen wanted to face such a thing as she was. Looking at Karen's sorry state, it was a miracle in itself that she would even suggest going to Hueco Mundo with the adversaries she would face. Not even counting the hollows, Yoryuki knew that Aizen was there as well. And Aizen's threat level was placed on a similar scale as the Vasto of White, the supposed king of hollows. Goatface will be able to understand, Karen said after a long moment. Her heart was pounding in her chest, either from fear or apprehension. Yet regardless, she had already made up her mind. I can't just leave Ichigo out there in danger. I have to try saving him because I know that he would do so for me. There was a resoluteness in Karen's eyes that caused Yoryuki's expression to soften. Something glinted over Yoryuki's face, and it was more than enough to unnerve Karen, who was under Yoryuki's gaze. If you really want to be able to do anything, then you'll have to get stronger. And the first step is unlocking whatever power you may have within you in the time available. It wasn't a coincidence that you and Ichigo could see spirits after all. Yoryuki closed her eyes in a silent apology to Ishine as she turned around and beckoned Karen to follow in a playful tone of voice. Sometimes as a woman, we're going to need some power to control our boys. For what did he fight for? Shifting his weight, Ichigo was just barely able to change his position when the pain set in. It coursed through his body, like snakes traveling up and down his arms. Heart pounding, he muffled the groan that was threatening to escape his mouth and then forced his eyes open to assess the area around him. The first thing he saw was a world of white sand and a dark sky illuminated by a pale moon. The cold chill of the air was unnatural, but there was a warmth he could feel securing his head in place. It was then that he froze, heart beating rapidly within his chest as his pupils dilated. There in front of him was a face he didn't believe he would ever see again. Soft orange tresses of hair fell over a curious face staring over his. That warm feeling he felt around his head was actually from the lap of the woman he was resting it on. She who stared back at him with a tenderness on her face that even she didn't know that she was displaying. It only took a single action for him to realize that she was gently brushing back his hair in a similar fashion as she once had in his youth. "Mom." His voice barely even came out as a whisper, and he himself hadn't been able to hear it. However, Silent did hear it. The hand she was using to brush over his head abruptly stopped as if she had just realized what she had been doing. Immediately, she moved to distance herself from him, but he wouldn't let her. Despite the pain of his body, his hands shot up with unerring swiftness to clasp onto hers with a death-like grip. There was no way that he wanted to let go. He needed to be sure that she was really here, that this wasn't some sort of twisted illusion. When he felt the heat coming from her hands, and the way her expression soon softened, the urge to cry immediately began to well within him. It had been years since he had let out tears, not since he'd made a promise to himself to never cry again. "Your boy has grown up." Swallowing, he forced down the tears he felt forming and looked at the woman before him as if his life depended on it. I have so much I want to tell you, Before he could put any other words together, Silent had already wrapped her arms around Ichigo and pulled him into a hug. Her hands finding purchase at the back of his head, she buried his face into the crook of her shoulder. It was at that moment, caught in a familiar embrace, that Ichigo could no longer contain it anymore. The bitterness he had felt, the sorrow, the guilt, it all came gushing out of him as if a dam had been broken. Yet he still restrained himself, not making a sound even as the tears began to seep into the fabric of the clothes Silent was wearing. Meanwhile, Silent stared hard at the other surrounding hollows near her. It hadn't been Ichigo's fault that he didn't notice them. After staring up at the clouds and noticing the dunes of white sand around him, the first thing Ichigo had seen was Silent. And that alone had taken all of his attention. It was kind of like a child who had seen their mom come to pick them up on their first day in grade school. Nothing else seemed to matter to them other than returning to that familiar warmth that had always lingered near them. Ichigo was much the same as a young boy, and maybe more so as he was always hiding behind his mother's back when he was shy around others. Seeking the one-sided protection a mother often gave, and neglecting everything else. Perhaps urged by whatever maternal instinct Silent was feeling, there was something in her gaze that was warning all the others hollows around her to stay away despite their curiosity. To be honest, Silent wasn't sure what she was feeling herself. These conflicting emotions began from the moment she entered the human world and began exploring the quiet town of Karakura. It was there that she first saw Ichigo and the rest of his family while she observed them from afar. And it was also there that led to all these troublesome circumstances. When she had first woken up, she had been in a daze as she stared at Ichigo's unconscious body. Thereafter, her body had moved subconsciously to cradle him in her arms. While doing so, Starkey had arrived and informed her of exactly what had happened. She felt terrible as a result, yet was also feeling a sense of belonging she didn't believe that she would have had been able to experience. After all, every hollow had willingly come to her aid, some even perishing as a result. And still, no one blamed her, rather, like Starkey, they inquired about her condition instead. This was probably the case with the hollows around her even at this very moment. Therefore, she felt cared for in much the same way she felt when she knew Shiro was looking out for her. Even still, towards those hollows at the moment, her gaze was unrelenting, making it uncomfortable for the other hollows to approach. Content that the other hollows wouldn't be approaching any time soon, she glanced down at Ichigo. She had the tiniest inkling of suspicion that Ichigo was somehow related to one of her life's regrets and the formation of her hollow hole. Why else would she do the things she had without even thinking of any consequences? Shifting her weight, she made herself comfortable as she waited for Ichigo to regain his composure. And when he did, the first words out of his mouth surprised her. "We have to get out of here," he said swiftly while tugging on her arm. To Ichigo, nothing mattered more than bringing Silent out to reunite her with his family. He could already picture how Yuzu and Karen would react when they see her, let alone his own father. They wouldn't be able to believe it until they felt her warmth for themselves, just as he had. Except, it was then that Ichigo noticed the other hollows nearby and paled when he sensed the spiritual energy they were exuding. Furthermore, when he noticed Silent shake her head, a sinking feeling began to take root within him. Especially when she opened her mouth to speak by instinct, and nothing came out. "Why your voice?" Ichigo said, horrified. Silent shook her head again with a ruefulness on her face as if indicating that it didn't matter. Ichigo fell quiet, but the grip he had on Silent conveyed his true thoughts. "We have to get out of here," Ichigo spoke wearily. Again, Silent shook her head. Thinking for a moment, she eventually gestured to the hollows nearby and watched as they soon left one by one. Only a couple remained to approach. Seeing the hollows approaching, Ichigo's spiritual energy began flaring, only for him to startle when he realized that it was no longer the pure blue of before. Rather, it was tinted with red and black, the use of his power seeming to form a hollow mask over his face. Immediately, he stopped drawing forth his energy, a cold sweat traveling down his back as he could literally feel that white version of himself smiling from within him. "Damn it!" he cursed while feeling helpless. However, another gesture from Silent caused the approaching hollows to hesitate before ultimately leaving when Silent began to glare. Ichigo was stupefied as he stared at his mother. He didn't know how strong Silent was, as she wasn't exuding very much spiritual pressure, but how was it possible that she was able to ward off so many hollows with just a few gestures and a glare? It didn't matter. Shaking his head, he just grew more determined to get her out of here before anything out of control could happen. "We have to leave," he insisted again. And once again Silent shook her head. Not being able to speak, this was as much as Silent could do. However, it was then that she thought of something. Taking out one of her fingers, she began to write on the sand. "Home" was written in fine and elegant print. When Ichigo read it, he didn't know how to respond other than to deny it. "No," Ichigo insisted, crossing off the word written in the sand before crossing his arms. "This isn't home." Silent stared back curiously, her expression one of confusion. "Home is with Karen, Yasuo, and Dad," Ichigo said without any doubts. However, when all he got in return was that same curious look, his expression grew heavy. "Karen and Yasuo, you remember them, right?" Ichigo pressed, feeling stifled when not a change appeared on Silent's face. However, he was able to catch a glint of recognition in her eyes that seemed to fade quickly. However, it was enough to grant him hope that this was indeed his mother. Why else would her actions be the same as the ones she had done in the past? The care and devotion she had shown were more than enough indications. Just that it appeared that her memoirs weren't exactly intact. Therefore, Ichigo had to bring her back. It was the only way he could think of to get her memories back. By staying in a familiar environment, there was always the chance. "Please," Ichigo said softly. There was something in Ichigo's expression that caused Silent to hesitate. Standing up on her feet, she put away all that had happened to her at the back of her mind. Who it was that took her out of that lab, and who it was that knocked her out in that cave, it all didn't seem to matter at the moment. Instead, she raised a tentative hand out towards Ichigo's outstretched one. "Yet. Oi Ichigo, you're awake." A bundle of joy smashed directly over the teen in question. A foot met a face, and Ichigo was suddenly eating a mouthful of refined white sand. He spat it out almost immediately, a vein popping over his head as he recognized from the voice just who exactly had run into him. Lilynette stood standing with a smug grin on her face. "You should have told me you were a hollow, Ichigo." She immediately expressed her mind. "To think I always treated you like a human." Grunting, Ichigo immediately exploded on her face. "That's because I am one," he yelled back, his head butting against hers. Lilynette staggered in response before her face contorted. "As if you were attacking Star K like one of the bloodiest hollows I'd ever seen. In fact, you were more of a hollow than some other hollows I know." Ichigo had no words. "Speaking of which, why'd you attack us?" Lilynette asked, plopping herself on the ground in a cross-legged position. Rocking back and forth with her hands on her ankles, she waited for a response. However, Ichigo had none to give, as even he could barely remember what it was that had happened. All he saw was Silent in Stark's arms, and then his mind blanked out as he met the white version of himself for the first time. And it was this completely white version of himself who had been in control of his body at the time. Scowling, Ichigo turned his gaze away before composing himself. He then pointed at Silent. "You had her unconscious in your arms," he accused. Lilynet looked at Ichigo as if he was stupid. "Are you secretly an idiot?" she retorted, her hands falling onto her hips in her exasperation. "The only reason so many Hollows and myself invaded the Soul Society was to save her. Of course, we would secure her to make sure she was safe. What else did you think we were doing?" Ichigo faltered upon hearing such information. All those Hollows attacking the Soul Society, and they had done so with the purpose of saving his mother? Lilynet crossed her arms and snorted. "If you didn't know already, the Soul Society was going to kill her if we didn't go save her. One for all, and all for one after all." Lilynet seemed to fumble with her words as if she wasn't used to them or didn't understand them. This observation was proven true when she shrugged then after. "I'm not really sure what it means, but Shiro said it one time before." Lilynet nodded her head in triumph. "Shiro?" Ichigo inquired, and when he did, he noticed both Lilynet and Silent's eyes brighten. Linet more from eagerness while Silent simply wished to convey her thanks. "Yeah, he's the best. Second only to Stark, but Stark can be an ass sometimes," Lilynet grumbled. "He said I couldn't meet with Shiro right now because he was talking with some Shinigami or whatever. And so, you went and found me," Ichigo said with a twitch on his brow. Lilynet nodded. "Now that you're here, it'll probably be more entertaining in Hueco Mundo. There's nothing much to do in the sand, which is why I thought it would be more fun if I went to the human world," Lilynet said. It was as if lightning suddenly struck Ichigo at that moment. He had long ago forgotten about his injuries and was already numb to the pain. "Why, you can go to the human world?" Ichigo asked. "Of course. This Lilynet only needs a single wave of a hand to open up a Garganta." Looking at Lilynet's boastful appearance, Silent was amused at the sight. Yet to Ichigo, it was like he suddenly saw water in a blazing desert. "We should go right now," Ichigo insisted. "There's a lot of other things I haven't shown you yet in the human world. Did you know they give free toys at the local fast food restaurant?" "Toys?" Lilynet froze. "You mean those things people play with? That gun-like thing that shoots darts that stick onto people?" Ichigo's brow twitched as he was fairly certain about which toy Lilynet was talking about. Clearly though, that kind of toy wouldn't be given out in a child's Happy Meal, but he steeled his expression and lied. "Of course, and it comes with burgers and fries too," he said, lying through his teeth. "We just need to go right now." Lilynet furrowed her brows on the verge of being swayed. However, she seemed to think of something at that moment, a light bulb lighting above her head. "Not yet," she said. "It'll be even more fun if we get Shiro to come." Ichigo's expression stiffened as Lilynet began to pull on his arm, ultimately dragging him in a certain direction. Silent followed behind. "This Shiro, who is he exactly?" Ichigo inquired nervously, getting a bad premonition as he struggled out of Lilynet's grip. Lilynet paused and placed a finger on her lip while she thought about her next words. It was then that she remembered the name most Hollows knew Shiro by. "Oh, Shiro's the Vasto of White," Lilynet said smilingly. One moment passed. Then another as sweat broke out over Ichigo's face. "No. No. No. Sometimes the man you see before you, isn't truly the man you believed him to be." All things considered, Shiro was on guard when he entered the small cavern Aizen, Jin, and Tuan were using as a temporary shelter. Despite Kyoka's faith in Aizen, he couldn't help but feel that there was something more about the man than just the calm exterior. It made him question what he thought was correct about the man, before having to promptly revise such opinions. Of course, Kyoka could sense his thoughts on Aizen and was far from happy. However, it was because of her vouching that he didn't think too badly of Aizen. The man probably had his reasons. As he stepped deeper into the cavern, the light of the moon outside began to dwindle into nothing more than fleeting rays of silver light that refracted along the walls. The resulting lighting was a mixture of dim grays and shadows that stretched far over the ground. It didn't take more than a couple more steps before he noticed the three captains on the other side. Aizen was at the center in the middle of discussing certain matters that weren't very important to Shiro. However, Shiro still decided to note down what he had heard with his enhanced hearing. Anyways, they soon noticed him and all signs of talking vanished. The other two ex-captains, Jin Ichimaru and Kaname-tuan, regarded him with an air of caution. Admittedly, his performance in the Sirati was an eye-opener of sorts. This was the same for all captains who had decided to undergo rigorous training after the ordeal. Lucky for those captains, they didn't have to deal with the infamous Vasto of White as quickly as Jin and Tuan. Among the three captains in front of him, it was only Aizen who looked at him as if an equal. This was admittedly more comfortable for him, as he didn't like the feeling of looking down or pressuring others. That was quite a performance, Aizen complimented. I'm sure that by now the Siriti is still in an uproar, and you the new enemy to unite against. Regardless of what I think, Shiro said, shaking his head grudgingly. You still have my thanks for saving one of my own. I am in your debt. Those hollows living in his supposed territory had become something of a family to him. Each one a hollow he could call as one of his own, as he just had. Aizen seemed surprised with his sudden thanks, Aizen's mouth curving upwards into a thoughtful smile that only emphasized his high cheekbones. Well, it's only natural that one keeps his end of a bargain, Aizen replied. Thereafter, Aizen fumbled for something in his clothes. You must be wondering why I went to all that trouble in the Siriti, and the answer to that is of benefit to both yourself and I, no, to all hollows in Hueco Mundo. Finished speaking, Aizen pulled out a clear pearl-like object. A transparent mist of sorts seemed to dance from within it. This is the Hogyaku, and I hope to get your cooperation in using it, Aizen explained. When Shiro first laid eyes on the Hogyaku, for a moment, the image of a holy grail appeared in his mind before vanishing. There was just something about the Hogyaku that gave him a familiar feeling. He shook his head to rid it of such thoughts, and then stared past the Hogyaku to question Aizen of his intentions. The Hogyaku eliminates the boundary that separates a hollow from a Shinigami, but I won't bore you on the specifics. Instead, it can be regarded as a tool to raise one's power and invoke one's hidden potential, Aizen said. Not a change appeared over Shiro's face, not even the raising of a brow could be seen. After all, if there was one thing Haribal and the other Vasto Lords knew, it was that Shiro never sought out for more power. Aizen's words would never move Shiro into action simply because he felt nothing of them. It was because of this, that Shiro was truly respected. How strong must a hollow be to not want to achieve further heights? No one ever looked down on Shiro for this attitude, for none truly knew the depths of his strength. Seeing that his words had little response, Aizen didn't waste a moment. Aizen was smart not just because of his mind, but because he was good at observing things. In the time he had spent observing Shiro, the Vasto of White, he learned something vital. There was only one method that would be able to move him into action. So long as the reason was to help or save others. That was enough of a motive for the lofty King of Hollows to act. Aizen swiftly shifted his approach, his mind articulating a grand scheme. It's not just power they would gain. Aizen moved his body to the side to reveal what he was hiding behind him. And the sight was able to garner a reaction from Shiro. Both of Shiro's brows rose in genuine surprise, his mouth opening without his notice. There in front of him appeared a hollow whose mask was broken, leaving behind only a panther's jaw on the right side of his cheek. Other than that, he was entirely human, yet multiple injuries and scars traveled down his body, evident from a fight that nearly cost it its life. This hollow had cropped blue hair and was fully naked, the shadows at least able to hide his modesty. By this hollow's side was what looked like a Shinigami's Zanpakuto. And from it, Shiro was able to confirm what he already knew. Grimjo Jaeger Jaquez stared back at him with what looked like respect before snorting and leaving without another word. Quite an interesting Vasto Lord, Aizen commented. I found him in a pitiful state in the Minos forest, but even still Grimjo was able to survive off of the hollows that tried to consume him. Commendable, do you think not? Shiro didn't answer, instead he was more focused on another aspect. And this aspect was how human Grimjo looked. Even the anger and malevolence that normally surrounded hollows was gone. For example, if Grimjo was still as he was before, Shiro had no doubts that Grimjo would have had attacked him in revenge. Instead, what he saw in Grimjo now was respect for a rival. What was that? He ended up asking. Aizen paced back and forth. You see, Shiro, the Hogyaku not only increases the strength of a hollow, but it also brings them closer to what we would call human. By breaking the boundary between hollow and Shinigami, the purifying properties of a Shinigami are integrated into the malevolence of a hollow. In a way, it brings them closer to who they truly were before becoming hollows, Aizen said. Thereafter, both Aizen and Tuan moved to excuse themselves from the cavern, seeming to have something important to do. As such, Aizen continued without turning around. The Hogyaku can alleviate the negativity one feels as a hollow. Or perhaps the better way of putting it, is that it heals the emptiness and hunger every hollow can feel. Are you not the same? Saying that, Aizen left the cavern with Tuan. However, the words Aizen spoke rung true in Shiro's mind, for even he as a hollow had an emptiness within him. That goes to show that every other hollow did as well, and if it could be healed, isn't that something worth doing? He was conflicted, and perhaps this was what Aizen wanted, but either way, he had to focus on something else at the moment. Staring at Jin Ichimaru, the only captain who chose to remain in the cavern, his expression grew grim, not out of surprise, but out of pity. Jin noticed his gaze, yet didn't pay it any mind as the man seemed lost in thought. Shiro was debating just leaving, but he couldn't allow himself to after staring at the figure next to Jin. It didn't matter what reasons Jin had for betraying the Shirai, but the pleading of Jin's Zanpakuto on behalf of its wielder was enough to instigate Shiro into action. Shinso. The blade that strikes under the blink of an eye. The spear that fells gods. And the spirit of it was bowing in his direction without moving a single muscle. It had been that way throughout the entire discussion with Aizen after it had realized that it could be seen. Stemming from Jin's blade, the Zanpakuto spirit formed was vague, yet still, its sentiments were able to be conveyed. Zanpakutos to a Shinigami were reflections of their very soul, and behind Jin's grinning visage, was a soul so heavily burdened that all one could do was smile to alleviate the pain. Shinso's posture was a plea for help. Even if it was impossible. He sighed helplessly, looking at Shinso, and eventually nodded, the action causing Jin's eyes to shift onto him. However, this was all for the best. Ignoring Jin's probing eyes and ever-present grin, he listened silently as Shinso spoke of its master's plight and troubles. And by the end of it, the pity he felt for Jin had already shifted into empathy. For it was something he felt he would do as well for another he cared about. Lips thinning, he stared hard at Jin, who stared silently back, ignorant of Shinso's actions. After all, for some reason or another, Zanpakuto spirits had a natural trust in Shiro, and in that regard, at least he whose soul was a world of blades would comply. Smiling ruefully, he really had to reconsider what it was that he was going to do. But then again, a thought resounded in his mind along with a memory of a boy walking through flames. You don't need a reason to save others. Opening his mouth, he steeled himself to say the words that he knew Jin needed to hear, the reflection of Jin's own inner thoughts conveyed by the spirit of his sword. If you were to turn into a snake tomorrow and begin devouring humans, he began slowly, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. And from the same mouth you started devouring humans, you cried out to me, I love you, would I still be able to say, I love you, the same way I do today? It was a pin-drop silence, the kind accompanied by the widening of pale blue eyes. And in the next moment, a blade was pressed beneath Shiro's neck in an instant. From the trembling of the sword, it was clear that Jin himself was not the one to stop it. It was Shinso. Pulling back from the blade's edge, Shiro stared at the murderous expression on Jin's face, before turning around to leave as if nothing had ever happened. Consider your choice wisely, for the woman on whose tears you vowed to rectify, may be brought to tears again by your own hands. He exited the cavern without another word. And Jin's eyes never left his form even as he left. A snake hiding in the shadows. Chapter 29, Interlude. In the dreadful silence of a sparsely decorated wooden room, a cane thumped against the floorboards and created an audible bang that gathered everyone's attention. The room itself was noticeably damaged, splintered wood and cracked walls letting in small rays of sunlight that shone over a somber mood. If everything is in order, then let this meeting commence. Yamamoto stared with his eyes towards the 2 rows of captains that stood before him, his expression hard to read. The Shirai had had a major upheaval, and the effects of it was something that Yamamoto predicted would last for several generations. More so when he considered the number of Shinigami that were either injured, killed, or lost their morale. It was like a decisive blow that aimed at the gut. Not enough to kill, but more than enough to hamper. The old days were gone, it was now a time of change. Yamamoto closed his eyes, and when he opened them once more, a fury like none before seemed to settle upon him. Every captain before him visibly flinched, Shunsui tipping his straw hat further over his face while none of the other captains dared meet Yamamoto's gaze. Of the captains present, 4 were missing. Aizen Saoshik, Jinichi Maru, Kaname Tuan, and Mayuri Kuratsuki. In the case of Mayuri Kuratsuki, Yamamoto had already received a report that explicitly explained that the man was in the process of recovering from a life-saving liquefying drug. Therefore, Mayuri had a reason for his absence, but the others were what truly angered him. They had betrayed the Soul Society. The grip Yamamoto had on his cane tightened until the knuckles of his hands grew white. Shameful. A strong shout, one able to vibrate within one's chest. It was both admonishment and disappointment towards both the captains in front of him and the captains absent. Those 3 traitors aside, were the lot of you so weak that you could not even hamper the enemy's movements? Where has all your training gone? Yamamoto criticized. No captain answered in rebuke. The times had been peaceful and the majority of the hollows that invaded the Soul Society were near zero. Never before had an invasion by hollows ever occurred since the founding of the Siraidai. As such, the blades of the Shinigami had grown brittle and dull in Yamamoto's eyes. For his was a time where there was no such safety as the Siraidai. Instead, it was a time rife with violence and blood. Waiwak, monarch of the Wandenreich, father of the Quincy, and the Vasto lords of Hueco Mundo. The enemies that threatened to annihilate the Siraidai's very existence. All now lacking in the current era of peace that Yamamoto and those with him had ushered in. War. Many of you have yet to experience it, Yamamoto began quietly, his head angling up. The battles of myself and the Siraidai's forefathers that established the Siraidai for what it is today, a realm of tranquility, peace, and order. Admittedly though, mistakes were made. The silence that stretched across the room was only echoed by the blank expressions on the other captains' faces. They knew that as captains, they had failed to live up to their duties in the face of an enemy attack, and this was evident by the staggering number of injured or dead. None dared speak. The silence that followed was stifling. While we bided our time taking pride in our victory in the war, it has become evidently clear that the Vasto lords of Hueco Mundo have far surpassed us in their tenacity to grow stronger. Yamamoto's expression became further inscrutable as he then turned his attention towards Anohana, who sighed. Head captain, Anohana bowed her head. Yamamoto nodded before once more opening his mouth to speak. You were still young then, Anohana, but do you recall the number of Vasto lords present in the past era? Yamamoto spoke loud enough for all captains to hear his voice. Subsequently, all gazes shifted towards Anohana, who didn't seem to show a reaction other than a dourness in her presence. Her mouth opened, a tiny whisper exiting past her lips, and the nearest captain sucked in a breath of cold air. Anohana whispered again, this time loud enough for her voice to carry across the room, causing all captain to visibly tense. Indeed, Yamamoto acknowledged. 4 great Vasto lords that ruled the hollows beneath them like sovereigns. It was from them alone that the Siraidai was able to document and ascertain that the combat capabilities of a Vasto lord are greater than those of the captains of the court guard squads. Yamamoto once again fell silent before his gaze lowered to the floor. And now, one Vasto lord alone had a power that equaled or surpassed all 4 of those great Vasto lords combined. Yamamoto's admission was spoken after careful deliberation on the matter. Each of those past 4 great Vasto lords held a power similar to a fourth of his own at his peak. After having faced the Vasto of White, Yamamoto was already certain of the danger that hollow represented. For that hollow's power was near Yamamoto's own not solely because of spiritual energy, but because of capability. The swords that appeared in the sky on that day would never be forgotten by any Shinigami who had seen it. Nor would they forget the hollow who stood at the front of a charge to pierce a line directly through the Siraidai. The Vasto of White, Byakuya said in disbelief. Is he really that strong? Unlike most of the captains present, Byakuya hadn't fought in the battle with the Hollows and had instead confronted Aizen with nothing to show for it other than more injuries. Even now, beneath his Haori were several bands of wrapped bandages and a splint to help mend broken bones. Yamamoto lifted his head and stared at Byakuya, causing the man to rein in his momentary outburst. Incidentally, Yamamoto wasn't the one to answer Byakuya's question, but Toshiro Hitsugaya instead. "More than you'd know," Toshiro answered, the action aggravating his injuries and causing him to flinch. Rangiku, who was supporting Toshiro, immediately frowned as the hand she had around Toshiro grew damp, the white cotton wrapping his chest steadily shifting red. "It's all right, Rangiku," Toshiro said through gritted teeth after noticing Rangiku's expression. "I can stand on my own." As Rangiku was about to protest, she stopped after seeing the stubbornness in her captain's actions. Any protest may lead to an outburst that may harm him further. Therefore, she closed her mouth and slowly made her way to stand with the other lieutenants of the court guard squads. Taking a moment to glance at Yamamoto to see if he could speak, Toshiro received a small nod for his efforts, allowing him to speak his mind. "I fought him," Toshiro said while grimacing from the pain racking through his body. "It's not only his spiritual energy, but the abilities he has at his disposal. Even now I'm being affected by it. This wound that won't heal." Anohana had informed Toshiro that no matter what she did, the wound itself wouldn't close regardless of the type of healing Kido used. It was something she described as a curse, some foul energy clinging to the wound that forced away any type of healing energy. Anohana had become somewhat distressed as a result but was still able to staunch the bleeding in time to save Toshiro's life. If the wound itself would heal properly, only time would tell. For other than healing naturally, Anohana was out of options. "The weapons he used," Toshiro said slowly to Byakuya. "They were Zanpakuto, some even our own." Byakuya's neutral expression faltered, his lips thinning as his eyes widened. "Impossible," was the first word that came to mind, but looking at everyone's somber attitudes, that conclusion was unlikely. Thus, there was only one question to ask. How? Zanpakuto were extensions of Shinigami's soul. For a hollow to possess one, it was simply too hard to believe. Toshiro's mouth opened and closed, he himself being unsure with how to answer like many of the others in the room. Instead, every captain subconsciously shifted their attention towards the one deemed the most knowledgeable. Yamamoto Genri Yusai. "His eyes," were the first words Yamamoto spoke while placing both hands over his cane. "Before those weapons in our very own Zanpakuto appeared, the pupils of his eyes would immediately dilate and contract upon sighting our swords." This was an observation only Yamamoto had been able to make due to his prowess and experience as the head captain able to catch the smallest of details. "Thereafter, our Zanpakuto were created from out of thin air," Yamamoto said seriously. "Then they must have been fakes," Byakuya reasoned. Yamamoto and those present at that scene at the time shook their heads despondently, so iPhone grimacing. "Fakes they may be, Captain Kukaki, but the connections we felt from them couldn't be faked. At that time, those truly were our Zanpakuto," Toshiro said, face paling from the effort of both forcing himself to stand on ceremony and speaking fluently. "I fear that so long as we use our Zanpakuto against the Vasto of White, he has the ability to undoubtedly copy them. Captain Zaraki should be the best example of this." Singled out by Toshiro, Zaraki Kenpeiga didn't even seem to react as the man himself was lost in contemplation. The shock of seeing the power of his own Zanpakuto astounded him, but at the same time it made him realize that for once, it may not be so bad to learn its name. Seeing that Zaraki wasn't going to help in his explanation, Toshiro could only frown and do nothing else. Still, Byakuya understood Toshiro's point and wordlessly acknowledged Toshiro's words with a nod. However, none of the two could understand the implications of Toshiro's words better than Yamamoto. "Those remaining captain who have not yet faced the Vasto of White, by my orders, do not reveal your Zanpakuto in his presence lightly," Yamamoto said. "We do not know the extent of this copying ability of his, but it's for certain that giving him more power to use is out of the question. A hollow like the Vasto of White who is not only strong, but versatile will be the greatest enemy the Soul Society will ever face. And don't forget, the Vasto of White isn't the only Vasto Lord we have to deal with. 7 others have already been confirmed, which is 3 more than the previous 4 Vasto Lords of the past era. Saying that, a weariness seemed to exude from Yamamoto that shouldn't have had appeared on an old man of his age. This was a problem for the newest generation of Shinigami, but the old just couldn't stand idle either. We do not know what the Hollows will do now, but I hope you take this previous battle as a lesson and increase the intensity of your training. Our enemies will only grow stronger, and to remain as you are now, is to stagnate. Yamamoto thumped his cane against the ground, creating a dull noise that caused Jushiro Yuka take out of his daze from brooding. This matter aside, there is another matter of concern. Aizen Saoshik, Jin Ichimaru, and Kaname-tuan. Ranjiku's body shuddered for a moment when Yamamoto spoke of Jin's name, but she hid it well from those around her. Byakuya on the other hand tensed as a murderous intent flickered through his eyes. They are traitors without a doubt, Byakuya said coldly. Yamamoto inwardly agreed with Byakuya's statement but didn't bother showing any outward response. It was more imperative for him to find out what those three's motives were. And at that time, the doors to the captain's meeting room creaked open, a purple-haired woman in an orange overshirt with 2 white straps entering the room. Around her waist was a large beige sash that was tied neatly around her. She sauntered in without a care for the hard gaze Yamamoto was glaring at her with, and leaned her back against a wall, her arms crossing beneath her chest. "Yo, head captain," she greeted, a smirk rising over her face. "You're Yuaki Shihoan," Yamamoto said irritably. "We are in a state of urgency, and if not for this, you wouldn't be able to do as you please after unceremoniously leaving your post as a captain." Yuaki shrugged. "Then by all means, go ahead and continue," she said, gesturing with a hand. "But please head captain, I know you understand me well enough to know that I wouldn't risk coming into your presence for no reason at all." Yamamoto deliberated for a moment before ultimately coming to a decision. "Speak," he said. Yuaki nodded, and at the next moment, any airs of nonchalance she once had disappeared to be replaced by a growing solemnity. "Well then head captain, how much do you know of Aizen Saoshik?" she asked. Chapter 31. Fingers wrapped against a smooth surface, an inscrutable expression flickering over Aizen's face as he sat alone in a cave dwelling within Hueco Mundo. His back was straight, and his gaze contained a contemplative gleam while regarding the Hogyaku in front of him. This was the work of a fellow researcher, and was fully deserving of Aizen's admiration, but it wasn't the main point of the matter. Leisurely, Aizen turned his attention away from the Hogyaku which had the ability to dissolve the boundaries between Shinigami and Hollow, and instead absently turned his attention towards the pest that had entered his dwelling. The sand in the corner of the room began to stir, creating a depression that a small masked head poked its way out of. It was a lizard-like Hollow, unaware of the danger that had now befallen it due to its carelessness. Without regard for anything, it fully emerged into the room, sleek body lined with scales creating an unpleasant rustle to the ears as its head surveyed the area around it. In a way, its ignorance caused Aizen to feel no small amount of amusement. After all, it lived in a world where it didn't appear to know of those that lorded over it, too insignificant to understand the concept of what it meant to be truly free from oppression and control. His eyes narrowed, his spiritual pressure locking onto the lizard-like Hollow and freezing it in place. An intervention by a higher power, and the feeble Hollow didn't even seem to understand its position as it uselessly struggled. A single thought, and his spiritual pressure would wipe out the Hollow's very existence. Yet he didn't do so, but rather watched for a moment longer before losing interest and letting the thing scamper away, burrowing back into the sand. Unlike that Hollow, Aizen was completely aware of his own strength and existence. He didn't live in a reality where he was truly free from the limitations that bound him. As such, he refused to accept it. His eyes narrowed as he refocused his attention on the Hogyaku. With just his power alone, he was confident that none would be his match, and yet despite everything, there was an existence that still stood above him. Of course, he wasn't so feeble-minded enough to be unable to accept such a thing, but what he couldn't accept was that the existence able to oppress him was no more than a linchpin holding the world together. Thus, an ambition had taken root within him in the pursuit of being truly free from limitation. A long road. One full of betrayals and deceptions, yet it was his to take. His mouth twitched in amusement when he considered the irony. He with the power to control others with an aspiration to rid himself of those who would rule over him. How laughable. He grasped the Hogyaku in hand and watched as the power within it seemed to respond to his intent, vapors of spiritual energy spiraling around his palm like a thin mist. It was no more than a tool for him to use at his disposal, but with it, it opened up his possibilities. To break the boundary between Shinigami and Hollows to aspire for a greater power. Still. Is that truly the reason? His lips thinned as he frowned to himself. There was a deeper meaning to the thought that just surfaced in his mind, and it wasn't one he was willing to admit. After all, with his strength, why was he gathering allies? Why was intending to use the Hogyaku's ability to heighten the capabilities of others rather than himself? He was certain of it. There wasn't truly a need to undergo his plans to create Arrancar if he just utilized his own competence to create an Okin, the key to the royal house. He wouldn't even have to wait and allow Kisuk and the Soul Society to react if he could simply overwhelm them with his power and the Hogyaku's combined. And yet he chose not to do so. Instead choosing to foster the strength of those around him. It was the same for the Hollows, and the same for Ichigo Kurosaka's unique existence. As such, the only question was why was he going through all the trouble? What exactly was he hoping for? His face gradually became inscrutable. Perhaps inside of himself, he already knew the answer, but it didn't mean that he would ever admit to it. Nonetheless, the main matter at hand did not lie with the Hogyaku, but with the cooperation of the Hollows around him. Reaching out his arm, he placed the Hogyaku back into its crystal container and stared out into the opening of his current dwelling, towards the white sands that encompassed Hueco Mundo and the Hollows that lived upon it. The Vasto of White and the Hollows who follow him. This Hollow was far more difficult to deal with than the self-proclaimed God King Aizen had already done his observations on. Charisma. Strength. Versatility. And above all, the loyalty the Vasto of White instilled in its subjects was an obstacle hard to overcome. To begin with, none of the Hollows he had spoken to out of those in the Vasto of White's lands adamantly desired more power. After all, they would eventually become Vasto Lords in their own rights after enough consumption of spiritual energy from the swords lodged in the sands. Therefore, why would those Hollows be enthusiastic about the notion of tearing off their masks and sealing their future prospects in evolution? It wasn't a choice many were willing to make in the face of a means of an already simplified evolution to a higher power. As such, the Ajichas and lower-leveled Hollows in the Vasto of White's lands outright refused his described process of becoming an Arrancar and gaining more power. To make matters worse, none of the current Vasto Lords were willing to take the procedure either without confiding in their Lord of Hollows, the Vasto of White. A light gleamed over the spectacles Aizen was wearing over his face as he decided that it was time to have a talk with that particular Hollow. For the Vasto of White was the key. And perhaps, just maybe, a friend. The further she walked, the more pronounced her agitation became. Her upper lip began to twitch, and her hands were steadily balling into fists. He's not here either, Lilynet seethed in frustration. Starkey had told her that Shiro would be in the cavern near where the Shinigami were staying, and yet she didn't find him there on arrival. Instead, all that greeted her, Ichigo, and Silent was an empty room. Silent patted Lilynet's head in an attempt to console her, but only ended up making her sulky, her lips pursing together as she clicked her tongue. Isn't it time to stop by now? Ichigo asked sighing. You've been leading us nowhere for the past few hours. After not finding Shiro in the cavern, Lilynet had not given up and decided to scour the area. However, the Vasto of White's lands were large and Lilynet didn't possess a means to lower the search radius. Instead, she just dragged Ichigo and Silent along to help search. Over the course of the journey, Ichigo had endured not just a single glance from other Hollows, but multiple. He was simply too unique if any word could describe him. He felt like a Hollow to other Hollows, but his appearance was rather contrary with just a mask over his face and Shinigami Shiakusho on his body. If it wasn't for Lilynet pulling on his sleeve as they traveled, Ichigo was certain that he would have had been approached by other curious Hollows. His shoulders drooped. On top of the worry he felt for the conditions of his friends when he'd last seen them, he wanted to get his mother out of Hueco Mundo as soon as possible. However, his goals were just too unlikely at the moment. He was too weak, and he could feel that the majority of the Hollows living in the area could crush him with just their spiritual pressure alone. They were nothing like the average Hollows he had encountered and opposed in Karakura town. What the hell was this place? The thought struck his mind. The hollows nearby were just too powerful. I suppose you're right, Ichigo. Lilynette had a wronged expression on her face. All that she had wanted to do was enjoy herself. The past few years were the best years of her life. Even if Starkey wouldn't admit it, she knew how he already felt. They weren't alone anymore. Every passing day, even if nothing exciting occurred, it was fine. Lilynette glanced up at silent Ichigo and then to the hollows in the distance before her mood gradually grew better. So, you're the hollow releasing that foul spiritual aura, a voice spoke from not too far away. Ichigo's gaze shifted towards a hollow with the lower body of a horse and the upper body of a woman. It was Neliel Tuadolshwank, a Vasto lord. Over the course of Lilynette dragging Ichigo and Silent around, they had ended up in a part of the Vasto of White's lands where Neliel and the Ajichas under her were living. Foul spiritual aura. Ichigo echoed, unsure of what to make of Nell's words. He had assumed that his aura was just as chaotic as a regular hollow at the moment. Indeed, Nell nodded. Your aura is like an open river, overflowing from out of you incessantly and filled with more chaos than an average hollow. In fact, just from the quality and power of it, it's as if a new Vasto Lord had appeared. You should understand my prompt arrival as a result. However, Nell's eyes narrowed. It comes off as a bit of surprise when I stare at you now. All that strength and you're simply letting it go to waste, the amount available to you minuscule compared to the amount you're letting off to dissipate into the air. Finished speaking her piece, Nell gave a pleasant nod to Lilynette and Silent before shifting her gaze back on Ichigo, who appeared perturbed. Then how do I use it? Ichigo asked. Power was the one thing he needed right now. To grow stronger. Nell rose a brow but smiled after considering that Ichigo wasn't one of those mindless hollows bent on exerting their supremacy. Instead, it appeared as if he had a reason to fight. A reason to attain power. Instinct, was what Nell said at the next moment. As hollows, from the very beginning, all that we had left was the instinct to survive and evolve. You should be able to feel your own power, it comes to you naturally. Nell extended out her palm and a pink zero began to form. Our energy is like an extension of ourselves, much like how Shinigami rely on their swords to aid in the direction of the flow of their spiritual energy. The energy of us hollows generally doesn't have a conduit as convenient as a Shinigami's sword. Instead, our powers are unbridled. Something harnessed with our willpower and fortitude. Nell's eyes narrowed as she stared at Zanjitsu strapped to Ichigo's back. No shortcuts by taking the blade of a defeated Shinigami will help, she said disapprovingly. You must use your power as your own. No, this is, Ichigo trailed off as he considered not correcting Nell's assumption. It was for the best that he not explained that Zanjitsu was his. Yeah, fine, you're right, he eventually said. Nell's impassive expression from the beginning softened after Ichigo's admission. The hollows she had met before arriving at the Vasto of White's lands were all difficult to get along with. Especially those that were arrogant or had self-pride. In fact, the more that she looked at Ichigo, the more that she was reminded of her first meetings with Pesha and the others who were her friends and followers. As such, she couldn't help but grow a favorable impression. Her arms fell to her side and as she fully faced Ichigo while staring at him up and down, she quickly made a decision. Meanwhile, Silent and Lilynette remained quiet in consideration of Ichigo. I must apologize, Nell began. Although it's true that instinct is the main factor involved in utilizing and controlling our spiritual energy, it still takes a certain level of skill to accomplish it. Saying that, Nell opened her arms wide and beckoned Ichigo forward. Attack me, she said frankly. Ichigo was stupefied at first but recollected himself when he noticed the seriousness in Nell's expression. His hand moved subconsciously to draw Zanjitsu from his back, but the motion caused Nell's face to blacken, which he took note of and consciously stopped himself. He breathed in and thought of what Nell had said. A power that came by instinct. It was almost as if he could feel the torrent gushing from within him. Thoughts and planning were irrelevant. All that mattered was destroying what was in front of him. That's it, King, just like that. A voice shouted from his inner world, and it was then that he felt it. The sheer volume. It was like an ocean, something welling from within him. The howling of a hollow. Guttural and deep. Vying for release. Lilynette gasped while Silent's face creased in worry. The image of a horned demon seemed to take form from the spiritual energy surrounding Ichigo. Not only did Lilynet and Silent react, others in the distance did too. After all, it was a primal sort of power. The reverence one would feel when faced with something incomprehensible. Nell's lips thinned, her focus on Ichigo increasing several folds. This wasn't the kind of power she was expecting Ichigo to be able to utilize immediately, and as such she released her own spiritual energy in preparation. "Come at me!" she yelled domineeringly, gaze unflinching. It was then that Ichigo moved. All of his power was concentrated on his fist as he punched out, black and red vestiges of energy cloaking the entirety of his arm. Nell scoffed, eyes darting as Ichigo appeared right before her. Naive. She rose a hand and captured Ichigo's fist within. In a clash of spiritual power, Nell's fingers gripped tighter and tighter before suffusing the energy in Ichigo's fist and tossing him to the ground. Tumbling, Ichigo groaned as his back smashed against a nearby rock before stopping completely. Nell stared at the bruises on her hand and the black spiritual energy that clung over it that nearly caused her to wince. Dispersing the black spiritual energy with a bit of effort, she stared peculiarly at Ichigo. He wasn't an Aegis, nor was he anywhere near a Vasto Lord. However, if he was still just an average hollow, then his attack strength was too absurd. His energy was able to penetrate through the natural defense of her toughened skin as a Vasto Lord. She blinked when she considered just what kind of strength Ichigo would have when he eventually became Vasto Lord like herself. Just thinking about it was terrifying, yet it was still far into the future. Still, she didn't let her surprise show on her face. "Now do you understand how to use your own power?" Nell questioned when Silent helped prop Ichigo up. Ichigo groaned as he moved himself away from Silent and forced himself to stand on his own. "More or less," he grunted out. "If that's the case, then good," Nell praised, however, her voice sharpened in the next moment. "However, you're an idiot. What kind of fool charges head-on against an enemy whose strength is far above one's own? What were you thinking?" Ichigo didn't respond. From Ichigo's expression, Nell knew well enough that Ichigo wasn't thinking. She pinched the bridge of her nose and closed her eyes in disappointment. Eventually, when she opened them again, there was a hint of exasperation on her features. But she didn't say anything else at that moment and instead just stared at Ichigo. He appeared to be a newly emerged hollow, and if anything, his reactions were likable. In fact, after Ichigo had noticed her disappointment, it was hard for him to maintain her gaze without glancing away. Her lips nearly twitched into a smile, but she forced the action down. Instead, she gave a glance towards Lilynet and Silent before the three of them came to a quiet agreement. Nell moved to stand in front of Ichigo, her back straight. "It would seem that you need more practice, but it will be inconvenient to practice here," Nell said slowly, trying to gauge Ichigo's reaction. "There's not enough danger involved. As such, follow me if you're willing. I know of a place more suitable." Nell turned her back on Ichigo and gestured for him to follow closely. Ichigo hesitated, as this wasn't exactly something that he expected. However, knowing that Nell was doing this for his sake and benefit, he shut up the protests in his mind and allowed his feet to take him forward. This would let him grow stronger, and perhaps be strong enough to protect those he cared about. Without turning around, Nell smiled in approval, slowing down her pace so this odd-looking and newly minted hollow could keep up with her. How strong Ichigo would become as a result of his actions would entirely be up to him. Lilynet and Silent trailed at the back. He was harder to find than expected, Aizen mused to himself as he avoided the detection of the hollows nearby and approached a certain location. It was a plateau overlooking Hueco-Mundo's vast dunes of sand, but Aizen wasn't much for looking at the scenery. Instead, his senses locked onto the figure motionlessly staring off across at the space. The Vasto of White. Aizen slowed his speed and approached while making his presence known by the fluctuation in his spiritual energy. Part of the reason it had taken him so long to find this particular hollow was that the Vasto of White had different areas where it chose to stay. This particular plateau was a new one different from the hill of sand Aizen had once found and observed the Vasto of White in. No other hollows were in the area, causing Aizen to raise a brow. From the way the hollows living in the Vasto of White's land revered their king, it was expected that several hollows would be at his beck and call. However, With the personality of the Vasto of White, Aizen already knew that that wouldn't be the case. Instead, it was more likely for hollows to simply remain in the king's vicinity to aid in any troubles. Contrary to expectations though, it was as if the Vasto of White knew that he was coming and relocated to a sparse area devoid of others. Perhaps it was a coincidence, Aizen mused, but it didn't really matter. He descended from the sky, landing a couple feet away from where the Vasto of White stood. "Aizen," Shiro called in greeting. Aizen simply replied back in kind before the conversation grew flat and quiet. Each of the two had their own thoughts to consider. A wind blew by, a common event in Hueco Mundo that shifted the positioning of the vast dunes. It tugged on the long white coat Aizen was wearing and at the same time blew along small plant-like tumbleweeds across the desert. He watched them silently as he gathered his thought for what he wanted to say. The Vasto of White was an individual that undoubtedly required his full attention, and despite knowing this, he couldn't fully explain his lack of apprehension. Perhaps he was just confident in his own spiritual strength, or maybe it had to do with the challenge of dealing with someone on a similar level. But no such feeling ever arose when he thought of confronting head captain Yamamoto. Therefore, it was a first. Someone he acknowledged that possessed a strength and means similar to his own. Although Yamamoto was strong, in the face of Aizen's own intelligence, Aizen was confident in dealing with the Shinigami head commander. Yet the Vasto of White was different. Kyoka Suijutsu's complete hypnosis was ineffective against the Vasto of White, therefore if push came to shove, only a direct confrontation would be able to settle things. Ability vs ability. However, he wasn't really inclined to make an enemy out of a hollow who may not necessarily be simple to deal with. As such, there was only one objective left to achieve, and it involved a single question. Was he friend or foe? A part of him revolted in the act of setting all cards on the table, but he calculated that it was precisely something that he had to do. He was no fool, and he knew that his previous actions in the Soul Society had already harbored suspicion on his character in the eyes of the Vasto of White. In fact, he had already considered the outcome before following through with his plans to attain the Hogyaku. Nevertheless, it was a necessary loss, and not one that was irredeemable. Of course, he considered another prospect in simply leading the Vasto of White on to further his own means, but the consequences of failure far outweighed the benefit. Besides, he would rather a colleague rather than a pawn. Yet a test was still necessary. Should he lay down all his cards and the other party still refuse to reciprocate his intentions, and instead hinder him, then there was no longer any room for negotiation. Do you know that there's a higher realm than the one that you and I exist in? Aizen probed slowly while inclining his head in an inquiring gesture. His eyes were trained solely on the Vasto of White, searching for a reaction of which there was none. Unperturbed, he decided to continue. Within this higher realm exists a power able to dictate and control our lives on a whim. We are the rats bound to the limitations and restrictions placed upon us by a fictional maze designed to be described as the world's natural order. As such, Aizen's expression became frank. We are not truly free. Aizen watched again for any changes in the Vasto of White's posture or expression but was yet again left with not a single sign to rely on. It didn't matter either way as he had yet to express his main point. Still, from the Vasto of White's lack of reaction thus far, Aizen felt that his chances of moving the Vasto of White to his cause were growing dimmer and dimmer. Still, Aizen was never one to give up halfway. You do not seek power, yet have power greater than any hollow. Aizen's eyes grew pointed, expressing the observations he had made on the Vasto of White. You lead the hollows that follow you yet have no ambition. You protect them, act as their guardian and they hail you king for it, yet here you are still upon this desolate hill staring off at a blank horizon. Aizen's words echoed silently into the wind, his voice reverberating. What is it that you see? What is it that you are looking for? Somewhere in Shiro's mind, thoughts appeared one by one and then vanished, replaced by a feeling of emptiness. Aizen was right in a way. When he stared off into the horizon, even he didn't understand what it was that he was searching for. It wasn't for any signs of hostile hollows, nor was it anything substantial or physical. Instead, it was simply a longing deep within him. You are a hollow but act more like a Shinigami. You save others, but in the end will still be left with no one to save. Shiro glanced up at Aizen, the first action he had taken since the beginning of the conversation. "Enough of this, Eisen, what is it that you are getting at?" Shiro spoke frankly, unwilling to admit that he felt something for the last words that Eisen had uttered. Indeed, over the course of saving others, in the end, there would eventually be no one to save. And the pattern only repeats, an endless cycle of one chasing something that was unattainable yet grand. "I want your help," Eisen said simply. "The higher realm I spoke of, within it lives an existence known as the Soul King. A being that can be said to be at the center of all realms, the human world, the Soul Society, and even Hueco Mundo. He who writes the laws of the world and rules above all, a being that can be said to even control individuals like ourselves. I want your help to be able to obtain freedom, and everything I have done thus far was for such a purpose." The Soul King. Shiro felt a pain in his head, causing him to waver. Something stirred from within him, a recollection, a memory, he didn't know. It was simply too fast to comprehend, like lightning striking forth from the sky. The meaning of one's existence. A reason to continue fighting, or what it was that caused him to end up in Hueco Mundo. It had been too long since he'd thought up on those concepts, never questioning them and instead apathetically maintaining a vigil over the white dunes of Hueco Mundo. To protect those in need of his protection, and to save those in need of saving. He had nothing else to concern himself with, but perhaps it was only because he was escaping from something. An answer. "Indeed, the Soul King is my objective," Eisen nodded his head. "Will you help me?" Eisen's words were sincere and Shiro understood that from how earnest Eisen was acting. There were no tricks involved, no double meanings, just a straightforward question. Eisen had spoken his mind and conveyed his intentions clearly. It had been years since Eisen spoke to anyone as an equal, as everyone had always been within his control in the world created by Kyuka Suijutsu. It didn't matter if one agreed or not in the illusion simply because Eisen didn't have to care about opinions, he could move others how he saw fit. Therefore, there was never an equal basis when Eisen dealt with others. Shiro was different. He was the sole individual who Eisen could not predict, influence, or exert strength over to be entirely under his control. So how about it? Eisen pressed for an answer. At this point, if Shiro didn't agree, then Eisen was certain that he had to revise his thoughts. Moreover, if Shiro did agree, but have other intentions, then Eisen would rely on his own mind to work things out. Not only did he not need Kyuka Suijutsu to play on one's emotions, it had already become a second nature to him. Perhaps he wouldn't have full control in this cooperation, but he could still influence, and that was enough. However, the best outcome was still that Shiro would be sincere in a cooperation. Shiro was silent for a long moment, his breathing even in a furrow in his brows, but eventually he came to a conclusion. Even if he still suspected Eisen's character, Eisen had made him realize something he should have had done long ago. He needed answers. Who he was, what was his purpose, and what it all meant. When Eisen spoke of the Soul King, it was undoubtable that Shiro had some sort of reaction to it. As such, to obtain his answers, there was merit in questioning the Soul King. A goal was set. "Very well," Shiro said, meeting Eisen's gaze. "I will help you, but I have my own conditions." Eisen smirked. "Name them," he said simply. 1. You are not to act on your own. "I dislike your methods in how you obtain favors from others," Shiro began. "Did you not think that by saving Silent and returning her to us, that I would not follow through with a request of yours? Instead, you hang her safety over our heads as insurance so that we do as you want." Shiro's eyes narrowed when Eisen opened his mouth to refute. "Don't say that that wasn't your intention, Eisen. Although you insinuated Silent was safe when we were in the Soul Society, it can also be taken that she would only remain safe as long as you deemed our efforts fit." Eisen closed his mouth and smiled wryly. "So be it, I won't act on my own, or at least not without informing," Eisen conceded. In the end, this request wasn't so difficult to deal with. After all, Eisen couldn't hide anything from Shiro anyway. His false realities were simply ineffective and anything he'd do would eventually be discovered anyway. Shiro nodded. "Second, you are not to harm those that aren't our enemies." Naturally, Eisen pushed up his glasses. "I would not do something to endanger our cooperation. Is there anything else?" Shiro shook his head. Nothing at the moment, he said. Good, then if you're done speaking then there's another matter that needs to be dealt with. The spiritual energy around Aizen exploded outwards, one of his hands moving to his face to remove his glasses. The very air seemed to tremble as hard rock began to dig into the ground, forming craters into the sand before the rocks themselves were buried within. A sharp gaze, one that was riveted by a power that threatened to crush all within an unrelenting pressure. The trees buckled and bent, fissures forming along the hard crystalline surface before the entire structure crumbled to pieces. Are you worthy of standing next to me? Aizen's expression grew cold, calculative. Nothing he had ever done was without purpose. He would not tolerate working with someone incompetent. No one stands on top of the world. Not you, not I, not even gods. Therefore, something must be done. The spiritual pressure in the area doubled once again. Grains of sand beginning to vibrate before bursting entirely into thin clouds that faded in a still wind. The unbearable vacancy in the sky. That which was left unfulfilled. A smile played its way across Aizen's face. Do you have the right to compete alongside me for it? Eyes narrowing, the spiritual pressure focused on a single point, the entirety weighing over Shiro's shoulders. Yet, those bronze eyes did not so much as flinch. Is that all? The voice was too apathetic, as if regardless of how much power Aizen exerted, nothing would change. One arm moved, followed by the other. Trace, on. A vortex formed, the tribal marks over Shiro's body branching out and glowing with a dull strength that seemed to envelope everything. Magic circuits. That which existed not within the physical body, but the soul. Conduits that converted the mana in the air into magical energy. It was as if Aizen had not exerted his spiritual pressure at all. The stiffness in the air, the tension in the surroundings, they all disappeared, sucked away by something out of even Aizen's own comprehension. Aizen blinked, then blinked again. You. The word escaped Aizen's mouth before he could stop himself. He stood there rooted, unable to understand what had just occurred, but composing himself nonetheless. Still, he made no motions of doing anything else aside from staring at Shiro like an even more complex puzzle. Was there a meaning in your actions? Shiro asked. If not for the fact that he hadn't detected any malicious intent in Aizen's actions, then Shiro wouldn't have even bothered asking. Of course, Aizen patted the dust off of his clothing. You see, if we are to be in a partnership, it is sufficient that we can understand the extent of the other's powers and abilities. Saying that, Aizen pointed a finger to a nearby dune of sand. Heido number 31. Shakaho. From the tip of his finger appeared a high-temperature flame that condensed into a massive orb several times larger than Aizen himself before blasting off into the dune. The air began to swelter and dry before a massive plum of flame and blunt force energy annihilated the dune from existence. As you can see, I am also proficient in various types of Kido, a Shinigami art based on advanced spells. The one that I just used in particular can only be judged as middle class, but with my absurd levels of spiritual energy, even mid-class Kido can prove lethal. I see, Shiro said, glancing at the direction of the previous dune. Glass had formed from the sand, smooth and reflecting the moon up above. Trust can only be achieved on mutual grounds, Aizen began candidly. I have demonstrated the extent of my spiritual energy and have given you knowledge of the strengths I possess. Aizen spoke no more, but his meaning was evident. Even if Aizen theorized that Shiro possessed a power similar to his own to allow Aizen to look upon him as an equal, proof was still undeniable. Aizen spoke of cooperation, but if Shiro could offer nothing with his power, then what was the point? Shiro didn't reply, but instead he knew he had to act. His eyes shut, the energy within him gathering. He who was a sword, would draw himself once more. It was a power different from any other, unique, and never before seen. Around Shiro, there was a peculiar blue light gathering. It was not the glow of spiritual energy, nor was it the malice of a hollow's natural aura, rather it was distinct. Kyuka Suijutsu began to stir by Aizen's side, causing the man's eyes to widen in alarm. From the connection with his sword, he could faintly comprehend its feelings. Attraction? Aizen's brows knitted together but loosened in the next moment out of surprise. Just what was going on? Shiro's eyes opened, the light surrounding him bursting out. He didn't summon a sword, he didn't summon a world, but instead he responded to a calling from within him. It wasn't something that he was experienced with, but it was different from the strength he had already shown Aizen in the Soul Society. The swords stored in an eternal armory. A lonely hill. And the request of an individual. The energy began to coalesce, taking form under Aizen's scrutiny. Pale skin, and a refined grace, eyes like mirrors reflecting a tranquil lake. It was a sword, yet not a sword. That which embodies the spirit of a sword but doesn't exist in the natural world. To give form to thought and recreate that which was uncreatable. The rustling of silk and the billowing of long black hair. A demeanor that was unmistakable. "I am possible," the words escaped Aizen's mouth even as he briefly glanced at the sword by his own side, his mind blanking. For before him stood a woman with a disposition no different from his own. One who sought a perfect state of existence. Kyuka Suijitsu. Hands grabbed at the hem of a dress before curtsying, a candid smile appearing over delicate features. "Greetings, Lord Wielder. Check the description for the links to the author."